The year 1908 arrived in Chicago with a bitter wind that cut through the narrow streets of the near West Side like a blade through cloth. In the cramped tenements where Italian families huddled together against both the cold and the uncertainties of their new American lives, a child was born who would one day command fear and respect in equal measure across the sprawling metropolis. Salvatore Gangana entered the world on May 15th in a third floor walk up apartment on Aberdeen Street, where the smell of garlic and onions mingled with the acrid smoke from the nearby factories. His father, Antonio Giancana, had arrived in America just 5 years earlier, carrying little more than calloused hands and the desperate hope that the streets of Chicago might offer something more than the poverty that had driven him from his native Sicily. Antonio was a compact man with weathered features and eyes that had seen too much hardship for his 32 years. He possessed the quiet dignity that comes from honest labor and the stubborn determination that had sustained his family through generations of struggle in the harsh hills of southern Italy. The tenement where young Salvatore took his first breath was a testament to the immigrant experience in early 20th century Chicago. Four families shared the single building, with thin walls that provided little privacy and even less insulation from the Chicago winters that seemed to last from October through April. The Giancana family occupied two rooms on the third floor, a space that would house not only Antonio and his wife Maria, but eventually their growing brood of children. The rooms were sparse but clean, furnished with hand-me-down furniture and the few precious possessions they had managed to bring from Sicily. Maria Giancana was a woman of quiet strength, her hands perpetually busy with the endless tasks of keeping house in such challenging circumstances. She had married Antonio in Sicily when she was barely 18 and had followed him across the ocean with the faith that wives of that era placed in their husband's judgment. Her days began before dawn with the lighting of the coal stove and ended long after sunset with the mending of clothes by lamplight. She spoke little English in those early years, relying instead on the close-knit community of Sicilian women who shared similar struggles and similar dreams. The neighborhood itself was a world unto itself, a transplanted piece of Sicily that had taken root in the industrial heart of Chicago. Aberdeen Street and the surrounding blocks teemed with life from early morning until late at night. Pushcart vendors like Antonio called out their wares in a mixture of broken English and rapid Italian, their voices creating a constant symphony of commerce that echoed off the brick walls of the tenements. The air was thick with the sounds of children playing in the streets, mothers calling from upper story windows, and the clip-clop of horses pulling wagons loaded with goods from the nearby markets. The smells of the neighborhood were as distinctive as its sounds. The aroma of fresh bread from the Italian bakeries mixed with the pungent odors from the stockyards that lay just to the west. On Sundays, the scent of simmering tomato sauce seemed to emanate from every window as families gathered for the one meal of the week that resembled the abundance they had known in the old country. In the winters, the sharp smell of coal smoke created a permanent haze that hung over the narrow streets like a gray blanket. Young Salvatore, who would later be known simply as Sam, grew up in this environment of controlled chaos and desperate ambition. From his earliest memories, he was surrounded by the constant struggle for survival that defined immigrant life in Chicago during the first decade of the 20th century. His father's pushcart was both the family's lifeline and its burden, requiring Antonio to rise before 4 o'clock each morning to secure his place at the wholesale markets, where he would purchase the fruits and vegetables that he would spend the day trying to sell. The child who would one day be called Momo by his associates and feared by his enemies was initially indistinguishable from the dozens of other immigrant children who filled the streets and schools of the near West Side. He was small for his age, with dark hair and the olive complexion that marked him clearly as Italian in a city where such distinctions mattered greatly. His eyes were perhaps his most notable feature, dark and alert, seeming to take in everything around him with an intensity that was unusual in such a young child. The Giancana household operated under the strict codes that Antonio had brought with him from Sicily. Respect for authority, particularly paternal authority, was absolute and unquestioned. Children were expected to contribute to the family's welfare from an early age, and Salvatore was no exception. By the time he was 7 years old, he was helping his father load the pushcart in the pre dawn darkness and spending his afternoons helping to sell produce to the housewives who would emerge from the tenements with their market baskets and carefully counted coins. The economic realities of immigrant life in Chicago during this period were harsh and unforgiving. Antonio's pushcart business provided barely enough income to keep the family fed and housed, with no margin for error or misfortune. A day of poor sales meant that dinner might consist of little more than bread and whatever vegetables had gone unsold. A week of bad weather could put the family behind on rent, creating a cascade of problems that might take months to resolve. These financial pressures created an atmosphere of constant tension within the household, despite the love that bound the family together. Antonio worked from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week, his hands growing more gnarled with each passing year from handling the rough wooden crates and dealing with the harsh Chicago weather. Maria's days were consumed with stretching every penny, mending clothes until they could be mended no more, and trying to create some semblance of comfort and stability in their cramped quarters. The neighborhood itself was changing during Salvatore's early years as successive waves of immigrants brought new challenges and opportunities. The Irish who had once dominated the area were moving further west and north, leaving behind a vacuum that was being filled by Italians, Eastern Europeans, and other newcomers seeking their piece of the American dream. This constant flux created both community and conflict as different groups competed for the same jobs, the same housing, and the same chances at prosperity. Within the Italian community, there were further divisions that reflected the regional differences of the old country. Sicilians, like the Giancanas, often found themselves viewed with suspicion by immigrants from northern Italy who considered themselves more sophisticated and better suited to American life. These subtle but persistent social hierarchies created additional layers of complexity in an already challenging environment. The schools that young Salvatore attended were overcrowded and understaffed, designed more to assimilate immigrant children into American society than to provide them with genuine education. The teachers, mostly Irish or German women who had little understanding of or patience with Italian customs and language, frequently treated their Italian students as discipline problems rather than children struggling to navigate between two very different worlds. It was in this environment that the seeds of Salvatore's future were planted, though no one could have predicted the direction his life would eventually take. The poverty that surrounded him was not the romantic poverty of noble struggle, but the grinding, soul-wearing poverty that forces families to make impossible choices between basic necessities. The violence that would later define his adult life was already present in the neighborhood, though in more modest forms. Fights between gangs of boys from different ethnic groups were common, and the police were viewed not as protectors, but as another form of authority to be avoided or, when necessary, appeased. The contrast between the official American dream and the reality of immigrant life was stark and unavoidable. While politicians and newspaper editorials spoke of America as a land of opportunity where hard work guaranteed success, the Giancana family and their neighbors lived a different truth. Hard work was simply the price of survival, and success, if it came at all, seemed to depend as much on luck and circumstance as on effort and virtue. As Salvatore grew from infant to toddler to young boy, he absorbed these lessons about the nature of American society with the unconscious thoroughness that only children possess. He learned that authority was something to be respected when it served your interests and avoided when it did not. He learned that money was power and that those who had it were treated with deference, while those who lacked it were ignored or dismissed. Most importantly, he learned that the official rules of society were often very different from the actual rules that governed daily life in the neighborhoods where real people lived and worked. The Catholic Church played a central role in the community's life, providing not only spiritual guidance, but also social services and a sense of continuity with the old country. The Giancana family, like most of their neighbors, attended Mass regularly at the local parish, where services were conducted in a mixture of Latin and Italian that helped preserve cultural traditions even as families adapted to American life. Young Salvatore served as an altar boy, learning the rituals and rhythms of Catholic worship, while also observing the complex social dynamics that played out even within the sacred walls of the church. The seeds of future ambition and future violence were being planted in the fertile ground of necessity and circumstance. In the tenement on Aberdeen Street, where four families shared thin walls and thinner opportunities, a child was learning lessons about power, survival, and the true nature of American society that would shape not only his own destiny, but the destiny of a great American city. As 1908 drew to a close and young Salvatore Giancana celebrated his first birthday in the cramped but loving embrace of his immigrant family, the stage was already being set for a life that would eventually span the spectrum from desperate poverty to unimaginable power, from the narrow streets of Little Italy to the boardrooms and back rooms where the real business of America was conducted. The transformation of young Salvatore Giancana from an immigrant child to a street criminal did not happen overnight, nor did it occur in the dramatic fashion that movies and novels might suggest. Instead, it unfolded gradually through the autumn and winter of 1921 when he was 13 years old and already showing signs of the restlessness and defiance that would define his adult life. The seeds of rebellion had been planted years earlier in the cramped tenement on Aberdeen Street, where the constant struggle for survival had taught him that the official rules of society often bore little resemblance to the actual conditions of daily existence. By the age of 12, Salvatore had already begun to chafe against the rigid expectations of his immigrant family and the broader Italian community that surrounded him. His father Antonio continued to rise before dawn each morning to tend his pushcart, selling fruits and vegetables to housewives who counted their pennies with the careful precision that poverty demands. The sight of his father's increasingly bent shoulders and weathered hands had begun to fill the boy with something approaching dread as he contemplated a future that seemed to offer nothing more than endless repetition of the same grinding routine. The neighborhood streets provided a different kind of education from the overcrowded classrooms, where teachers struggled to maintain order among children who spoke a dozen different languages at home. In the alleys and vacant lots between the tenements, young Salvatore discovered a world where intelligence and audacity mattered more than compliance and respectability. The older boys who gathered in these informal spaces spoke with casual familiarity about activities that would have scandalized their parents, and their pockets often contained more money than their fathers earned in a week of honest labor. School had become increasingly irrelevant to Salvatore's daily concerns by the time he entered his teenage years. The curriculum seemed designed for children who could afford to think about distant futures rather than immediate necessities, and the teachers showed little interest in adapting their lessons to the realities of immigrant life. Truancy became a regular occurrence, though Salvatore was careful to maintain the appearance of attendance when his parents inquired about his academic progress. The first actual criminal act that Salvatore committed was modest in scope, but significant in its psychological impact. On a cold October morning in 1921, he and two other boys from the neighborhood decided to steal coal from the rail yard that served the nearby factories. The theft itself was almost absurdly simple. The boys waited until the shift change at 2:30 in the afternoon, when the yard was briefly unattended, and then filled several burlap sacks with the chunks of coal that had fallen from the freight cars during loading operations. The coal was desperately needed in all of their households, as the early arrival of winter had caught many families unprepared for the expense of heating fuel. What struck Salvatore most forcefully about the experience was not the act of theft itself, but rather the realization that he felt no guilt or remorse about taking something that did not belong to him. The coal company, he reasoned, would never miss such a small amount, while his family's need was immediate and real. This simple calculation, this weighing of abstract property rights against concrete human necessity, represented a fundamental shift in his moral reasoning. The success of the coal theft led inevitably to other small crimes, each one slightly more ambitious than the last. Salvatore and his growing circle of associates began to systematically explore the vulnerabilities of the local economy, identifying opportunities for quick profit that carried minimal risk of serious consequences. They learned to watch the patterns of delivery trucks, noting which drivers were careless with their cargo and which routes offered the best opportunities for quick strikes. The produce markets where Salvatore had spent so many hours helping his father became a particularly attractive target. The boys developed an elaborate system for distracting vendors, while one or two of them filled their pockets with fruit or small items that could be easily resold to housewives who were happy to pay slightly below market price and ask no questions about the source of their bargains. The irony that Salvatore was essentially stealing from men who shared his father's circumstances and struggles was not lost on him, but he had already begun to adopt the hard pragmatism that would characterize his adult decision making. The psychological transformation that accompanied these early criminal activities was perhaps more significant than the crimes themselves. Salvatore discovered that he possessed a natural talent for reading people and situations, for identifying weaknesses that could be exploited and opportunities that others might miss. He also found that he felt genuinely energized by the adrenaline rush that came with operating outside the boundaries of conventional society. The carefully ordered world of his parents, with its emphasis on hard work, sacrifice, and deferred gratification, began to seem not just unappealing, but actually foolish. The formation of what would later be known as the 42 Gang began during the winter months of 1921 and 1922, when Salvatore was still just 13 years old. The name itself came from the address of an abandoned building on West Taylor Street, where the boys had taken to gathering during the coldest weeks of the year. The building had once housed a small manufacturing concern, but the business had failed during the economic uncertainty that followed the Great War, leaving behind a warren of empty rooms that provided shelter from both the weather and the scrutiny of adults. The early membership of the 42 gang consisted primarily of Italian boys from the immediate neighborhood, though it gradually expanded to include Irish and Polish youths who shared similar backgrounds of poverty and limited opportunities. What united them was not ethnic solidarity, but rather a common recognition that the conventional paths to prosperity were either closed to them entirely or so slow and uncertain as to be effectively meaningless. They were boys who had watched their fathers work themselves into premature old age for wages that barely covered rent and food, and they had concluded that there had to be better alternatives. Under Salvatore's emerging leadership, the gang developed a surprisingly sophisticated organizational structure for such young criminals. Different members were assigned specific roles based on their individual talents and temperaments. Some served as lookouts, positioned to watch for police or other threats while operations were conducted. Others specialized in what might be called customer relations, developing networks of people who were willing to purchase stolen goods without asking uncomfortable questions about their origins. The crimes committed by the 42 gang during this early period were still relatively modest in scope and ambition. They focused primarily on theft of goods that could be easily transported and quickly sold, avoiding anything that might attract serious attention from law enforcement. Clothing from delivery trucks, tools from construction sites, and food from markets and warehouses made up the bulk of their activities. The profits were shared according to a complex system that rewarded both participation in specific crimes and contributions to the gang's overall operations. What set Salvatore apart from his associates, even during these early years, was his instinctive understanding of the importance of maintaining good relationships with the adults who controlled the neighborhood's informal economy. While other members of the gang sometimes treated their criminal activities as a kind of elaborate game, Salvatore recognized that they were actually apprenticing themselves in a business that required the same attention to customer service and reputation management as any legitimate enterprise. The local police, when they occasionally took notice of the gang's activities, generally treated them as a minor nuisance rather than a serious threat. The crimes were small enough that they rarely justified the time and effort required for thorough investigation, and the boys were skilled at avoiding the kinds of dramatic confrontations that might have forced a more aggressive response. When arrests did occur, they typically resulted in brief stays in juvenile detention facilities that served more as networking opportunities than as genuine punishment. The winter of 1922 brought both increased criminal activity and the first signs of more serious consequences. A series of thefts from a warehouse that supplied local grocers had begun to attract attention from property owners who were less willing than most to simply write off their losses as a cost of doing business. Private security guards were hired to patrol the area, and the casual atmosphere that had previously characterized the gang's operations began to give way to something more focused and professional. It was during this period that Salvatore first encountered adults whose involvement in criminal activities went far beyond the opportunistic thievery that had occupied his own attention. These were men who operated with the calm confidence that comes from knowing that one's activities are protected by carefully maintained relationships with police, judges, and politicians. They moved through the neighborhood's streets and businesses with an authority that was immediately recognizable to anyone who understood the true dynamics of urban power. The realization that crime could be not just profitable but actually respectable, at least within certain circles, represented another crucial step in Salvatore's psychological development. He began to understand that the dividing line between legitimate and illegitimate business was often less clear than conventional morality suggested, and that success in either realm depended largely on one's ability to navigate complex webs of mutual obligation and self interest. As spring arrived in 1923, bringing warmer weather and new opportunities for outdoor activities, Salvatore found himself increasingly drawn to the company of these older, more sophisticated criminals. The 42 gang continued to provide him with a base of operations and a source of income, but he had begun to view it as a stepping stone rather than a permanent affiliation. The neighborhood's established criminal hierarchy was starting to take notice of the ambitious teenager who seemed to possess an unusual combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and strategic thinking. The transition from petty theft to more serious criminal activities would not happen immediately, but the foundations were already being laid during these formative months. Salvatore had learned to think of crime not as a series of isolated acts, but as components of a larger business enterprise that required careful planning, reliable associates, and ongoing relationships with both customers and suppliers. He had also begun to develop the psychological armor that would allow him to commit increasingly serious crimes without being paralyzed by guilt or remorse. As the summer of 1923 approached, bringing with it new opportunities and new challenges, the boy who had once helped his father sell vegetables from a pushcart was preparing to enter a world where the stakes would be measured not in dollars and cents, but in life and death. The transformation was far from complete, but the essential elements of his criminal character were already firmly in place. The education of Salvatore Giancana in the deeper mysteries of organized crime began not with dramatic initiation ceremonies or sudden revelations, but through the patient observation of men who understood that true power operated most effectively when it remained largely invisible. During the summer and autumn of 1923, when he was 15 years old and already displaying the keen intelligence that would later serve him so well, Salvatore found himself drawn into the orbit of criminals whose sophistication far exceeded anything he had previously encountered in the rough and tumble world of the 42 gang. The neighborhood barber shop on South Halsted Street served as his first classroom in this more advanced curriculum. The establishment, owned by a soft spoken man named Giuseppe Torino, appeared to be nothing more than what it claimed to be during the daylight hours when legitimate customers came for haircuts and shaves. The familiar sounds of scissors clicking and razors scraping against leather strops created a comfortable atmosphere of everyday commerce, while the scent of bay rum and talcum powder masked more subtle odors that suggested other kinds of business were conducted after the official closing time. It was Giuseppe who first recognized something special in the restless teenager who had begun hanging around the shop during the slow afternoon hours. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who mistook loudness for strength and flashiness for success, Salvatore possessed an unusual ability to listen carefully and speak only when he had something worthwhile to contribute to the conversation. This quality, relatively rare among ambitious young men of any era, marked him as someone who might be capable of learning the more complex lessons that the criminal life had to offer. The barbershop served as an informal meeting place for men whose legitimate occupations provided convenient covers for their actual sources of income. They were importers who specialized in goods that never appeared on customs documents. labor organizers whose negotiations involved more than wages and working conditions, and businessmen whose success seemed remarkably unaffected by the economic uncertainties that plagued their more conventional competitors. Their conversations, conducted in a mixture of English and Italian that excluded most casual listeners, gradually educated Salvatore in the realities of how money and power actually moved through the city. The most important lesson that Salvatore learned during this period was that successful criminal organizations operated according to principles that were remarkably similar to those that governed legitimate businesses. They required careful planning, reliable sources of supply, efficient distribution networks, and satisfied customers who could be counted upon to provide repeat business. The main difference was that criminal enterprises also required protection from law enforcement, which necessitated the cultivation of relationships with police officers, prosecutors, and judges who were willing to overlook certain activities in exchange for appropriate compensation. Vincent Cosmano, who served as something of an informal mentor to Salvatore during this crucial period, exemplified the kind of sophisticated criminal that the teenager aspired to become. Cosmano was a man in his early 40s who dressed with understated elegance and spoke with the quiet authority that comes from knowing that one's words carry weight in circles that matter. His official occupation was that of a labor contractor, arranging employment for recent immigrants in the construction trades. But his real business involved the systematic exploitation of Prohibition era opportunities that had created new avenues for enormous profit. Under Cosmano's patient guidance, Salvatore began to understand that the criminal hierarchy that controlled much of Chicago's illegal activity was far more complex and sophisticated than the simple gang structure that had characterized his earlier experiences. The organization was divided into distinct territories and specialized functions, with clear chains of command that ensured both efficiency and security. Men who demonstrated reliability and intelligence could advance through the ranks, but only if they proved their ability to follow orders without question and maintain absolute discretion about the organization's activities. The concept of omerta, the code of silence that governed relationships within the criminal community, was perhaps the most crucial lesson that Salvatore absorbed during this period. He learned that survival in the underworld depended not just on one's ability to commit crimes successfully, but on one's capacity to endure interrogation, imprisonment, and even physical torture without revealing information that might compromise other members of the organization. This was not simply a matter of loyalty or honor, though both of these qualities were valued, but rather a practical necessity that ensured the continued operation of enterprises that generated enormous profits for everyone involved. The autumn of 1923 brought Salvatore his first opportunity to participate in criminal activities that extended beyond the relatively simple theft and resale operations that had occupied the 42 gang. Cosmano arranged for him to serve as a lookout during a series of hijackings that targeted trucks carrying illegal alcohol from rural distilleries to the speakeasies that were proliferating throughout Chicago. The work required him to maintain positions along predetermined routes for hours at a time, watching for police patrols or rival criminals who might interfere with the operations. The experience taught Salvatore important lessons about the military-like precision that characterized successful criminal enterprises. Every detail of the hijacking operations had been carefully planned in advance, from the selection of target vehicles to the identification of safe houses where stolen merchandise could be stored until it could be distributed to customers. The men who carried out these crimes moved with the calm professionalism of soldiers executing well rehearsed maneuvers, and their success depended as much on intelligence gathering and advanced preparation as on courage or physical prowess. More importantly, Salvatore began to understand how the profits from these activities were distributed through the criminal organization. The men who actually stopped the trucks and seized the merchandise received only a small percentage of the total value, while larger shares went to those who provided the intelligence that made the crimes possible, arranged for the disposal of the stolen goods, and maintained the political connections that ensured minimal interference from law enforcement. This system rewarded strategic thinking and relationship building at least as much as it rewarded direct participation in criminal acts. The winter months of 1923 and 1924 provided Salvatore with opportunities to observe the social dynamics that governed interactions between different levels of the criminal hierarchy. The men who occupied positions of real authority within the organization were notable not for their willingness to engage in violence, though they were certainly capable of brutality when circumstances required it, but for their ability to resolve conflicts through negotiation and compromise. They understood that unnecessary violence was bad for business, attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement and creating instability that reduced profits for everyone involved. These observations shaped Salvatore's developing understanding of how power actually operated within criminal organizations. He learned to distinguish between the theatrical displays of aggression that impressed outsiders and the quiet exercise of influence that actually determined outcomes. The men who commanded the most respect were those who could achieve their objectives through careful planning and strategic thinking, resorting to violence only when other methods had proven insufficient. The social clubs that served as informal headquarters for various criminal enterprises provided another venue for Salvatore's education in the complexities of underworld politics. These establishments, usually located in basement rooms beneath legitimate businesses, functioned as combination meeting halls, social centers, and communication networks for men whose activities required them to maintain regular contact with associates while avoiding the attention of law enforcement. The clubs operated according to elaborate protocols that governed everything from seating arrangements to the topics of conversation that were considered appropriate for discussion in the presence of newer members. It was in these clubs that Salvatore first encountered the elaborate system of mutual obligations and reciprocal favors that bound the criminal community together. He learned that success in the underworld depended not just on one's ability to generate profits, but on one's willingness to provide assistance to other members of the organization when such help was needed. These obligations created networks of loyalty and interdependence that were far stronger than any formal contracts or legal agreements. The spring of 1924 brought new challenges and new opportunities as law enforcement agencies began to adapt their strategies to the changing nature of criminal activity in Chicago. The relatively casual approach that had previously characterized police responses to organized crime was giving way to more systematic efforts to penetrate criminal organizations and gather intelligence about their operations. This development forced the underworld to become more careful about security measures and more selective about the recruitment of new members. For Salvatore, this changing environment created both obstacles and advantages. The increased scrutiny made it more difficult for younger criminals to gain access to the more lucrative opportunities that the organization had to offer, but it also meant that those who did prove their reliability and discretion were more highly valued than they might have been in earlier, more permissive times. The organization needed intelligent young men who could adapt to changing circumstances and carry out increasingly complex assignments without compromising the security of the overall enterprise. The lessons that Salvatore learned during this apprenticeship period would serve as the foundation for all of his later criminal activities. He had discovered that successful criminals were not the impulsive, violence prone individuals depicted in newspaper accounts and popular fiction, but rather careful strategists who understood the importance of planning, organization, and relationship building. He had learned to think of crime not as a series of desperate expedients, but as a business enterprise that could provide both financial security and social status for those who approached it with appropriate seriousness and intelligence. As the summer of 1924 approached, bringing with it new opportunities for advancement within the criminal hierarchy, Salvatore had completed his basic education in the principles that governed underworld operations. He understood the importance of loyalty, discretion, and strategic thinking, and he had demonstrated his ability to carry out assignments without attracting unwanted attention or compromising the security of his associates. The foundation had been laid for what would eventually become one of the most successful and notorious criminal careers in American history. The teenager, who had once stolen coal to heat his family's tenement apartment, had evolved into a young man who understood that true power in the criminal world belonged to those who could think several moves ahead of their opponents and maintain their composure under pressure. The next phase of his education would involve learning how to translate this understanding into concrete achievements that would establish his reputation within the organization and position him for even greater opportunities in the years ahead. The opportunity that would transform Salvatore Giancana from a promising apprentice into a recognized member of Chicago's criminal elite arrived on a humid August evening in 1925 when the air hung heavy over the city like a damp blanket and the streets shimmered with heat that seemed to rise from the very pavement itself. The setting was unremarkable, a small restaurant on West Taylor Street that served as one of many informal meeting places where the city's underworld conducted its business away from the scrutiny of law enforcement and the curiosity of legitimate citizens. Antonio Lombardozzi, a man whose reputation for both intelligence and ruthlessness had earned him a position of considerable authority within the Chicago outfit, had been observing Salvatore's development for several months with the patient attention that experienced criminals devoted to the identification and cultivation of potential talent. Lombardozzi understood that the organization's continued success depended not just on the loyalty and competence of its current members, but on its ability to identify and develop the next generation of leaders who would guide its operations through the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The 17-year-old Salvatore, who sat across from Lombardozzi in the restaurant's dimly lit back room, bore little resemblance to the desperate child who had once stolen coal to heat his family's tenement apartment. His clothes, while not expensive, were clean and well fitted, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that one's abilities have been recognized and valued by people who matter. His dark eyes, always alert and intelligent, now reflected an understanding of the criminal world's complexities that would have been remarkable in a man twice his age. Lombardozzi explained the situation with the methodical precision that characterized his approach to all business matters. A rival organization from the South Side had been systematically encroaching on territory that the Chicago outfit considered its exclusive domain, creating a situation that required immediate and decisive action. The interlopers had been warned through the usual diplomatic channels, but they had chosen to interpret the outfit's restraint as weakness rather than respect for the established protocols that governed territorial disputes. The task that Lombardozzi proposed was both straightforward and extraordinarily dangerous. Salvatore would lead a small team in an operation designed to send an unmistakable message to the Southside organization about the consequences of continued territorial violations. The operation would require careful planning, flawless execution, and absolute discretion, as any mistakes could result in either a violent retaliation that might escalate into open warfare or increased attention from law enforcement agencies that were already showing disturbing signs of becoming more aggressive in their pursuit of organized crime. What made this opportunity particularly significant was not just the complexity and importance of the assignment, but the degree of responsibility that Lombardozzi was prepared to entrust to someone so young and relatively inexperienced. In the hierarchical world of organized crime, where advancement typically came only after years of proven service in subordinate roles, the chance to plan and execute an operation of this magnitude represented an unprecedented vote of confidence in Salvatore's abilities and potential. The target of the operation was a speakeasy on South Wabash Avenue that served as both a source of revenue and a symbol of authority for the rival organization. The establishment operated with the brazen confidence that suggested its owners believed themselves to be beyond the reach of their competitors, serving high quality illegal alcohol to customers who included not just neighborhood residents, but also police officers, municipal employees, and other individuals whose patronage provided both legitimacy and protection. Salvatore spent the better part of 2 weeks conducting surveillance of the target, learning the patterns and routines that governed its daily operations. He observed the establishment during different times of day and different days of the week, noting when it was busiest and when it was most vulnerable, identifying the security measures that protected it and the weak points that might be exploited. This careful preparation reflected both his natural intelligence and the lessons he had absorbed during his apprenticeship about the importance of thorough planning in successful criminal enterprises. The team that Salvatore assembled for the operation consisted of 4 other young men whose loyalty and competence had been established through previous collaboration on smaller assignments. Each member was assigned specific responsibilities based on his individual talents and temperament, creating a division of labor that maximized the group's collective effectiveness while minimizing the risks that might arise from confusion or miscommunication during the actual execution of the plan. The operation itself was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in early September, when the speakeasy's regular customers would be present in sufficient numbers to ensure that word of the incident would spread quickly through the Southside organization, but not so many that the situation might become uncontrollable. Salvatore had chosen this timing after careful consideration of factors that included not just the establishment's customer patterns, but also the patrol schedules of local police officers and the likelihood of encountering unexpected complications. As the appointed evening approached, Salvatore found himself experiencing a complex mixture of anticipation and anxiety that reflected both his youth and the magnitude of the responsibility that had been placed upon him. He understood that success in this assignment would establish his reputation within the Chicago outfit and position him for even greater opportunities in the future. But he also recognized that failure could result in consequences that extended far beyond his own personal fortunes. The speakeasy occupied the basement level of a 3-story brick building that had been constructed in the 1890s when the neighborhood had been home to German and Irish immigrants who worked in the nearby stockyards and manufacturing plants. The building's architecture, with its heavy masonry construction and small windows, provided natural security advantages that had been enhanced by the installation of a steel door and other modifications designed to prevent unwanted intrusions. Salvatore and his team approached the building through the alley that ran along its western side, moving with the careful deliberation of men who understood that their success depended as much on avoiding detection as on the boldness of their actions once the operation began. The September evening was cool and clear, with a gentle breeze that carried the mingled scents of cooking food, automobile exhaust, and the slightly sweet odor of illegal alcohol that seemed to permeate the entire neighborhood. The operation unfolded with the precision that reflected both careful planning and the natural coordination that develops among men who have learned to work together under pressure. While 2 team members maintained watch positions that allowed them to monitor both ends of the alley, Salvatore and the remaining members gained entry to the building through a rear door that had been left unlocked by a dishwasher whose cooperation had been secured through a combination of financial incentives and subtle threats. The interior of the speakeasy was dimly lit and filled with the comfortable hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses that characterized such establishments during their busiest hours. The customers, mostly men in their 30s and 40s, who worked in the legitimate businesses that provided cover for the neighborhood's illegal activities, seemed relaxed and unsuspecting as they enjoyed the high-quality whiskey and beer that the establishment provided. What happened next represented a masterpiece of psychological warfare that achieved its objectives without resorting to the kind of dramatic violence that might have attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement or provoked an immediate and possibly uncontrollable retaliation. Salvatore and his companions made their presence known in a manner that was unmistakably threatening but carefully calibrated to avoid causing panic or serious injury to innocent customers who happened to be present. The message that Salvatore delivered to the speakeasy's owner was brief and unambiguous, conveying the Chicago outfit's position regarding territorial boundaries and the consequences that would follow any future violations of established agreements. The delivery of this message was accompanied by actions that demonstrated the organization's ability to reach anyone, anywhere, at any time, regardless of what security measures they might believe protected them. The entire operation was completed in less than 15 minutes, with Salvatore and his team withdrawing as quietly and efficiently as they had arrived. The psychological impact of their visit, however, would resonate throughout the Southside organization for months to come, serving as a constant reminder of the price that would be paid for any further attempts to encroach on Chicago outfit territory. The success of the operation exceeded even Lombardozzi's expectations, establishing Salvatore's reputation as someone who possessed not just the courage and intelligence necessary for complex criminal enterprises, but also the rare combination of strategic thinking and tactical execution that marked natural leaders within the hierarchical structure of the Chicago outfit, where advancement typically came only after years of proven service. This single operation had elevated Salvatore from the ranks of promising apprentices to the more exclusive circle of individuals who were entrusted with significant responsibility and authority. The weeks that followed brought a series of new opportunities and challenges as Salvatore found himself assigned to increasingly complex and lucrative operations. His success in the South Side assignment had demonstrated his ability to plan and execute sophisticated criminal enterprises, but it had also marked him as someone whose activities would likely attract attention from both rival organizations and law enforcement agencies. The transformation from street criminal to recognized member of Chicago's organized crime hierarchy represented more than just a change in status or income, though both of these factors were certainly significant. It marked Salvatore's entry into a world where the stakes were measured not just in dollars and cents, but in life and death, where loyalty and betrayal carried consequences that extended far beyond individual relationships, and where success required the kind of cold calculation that few men possessed. As autumn settled over Chicago in 1925, bringing with it the crisp air and changing leaves that marked the transition from summer to winter, Salvatore Giancana stood on the threshold of a criminal career that would eventually make him one of the most powerful and feared men in America. The big break had come, and he had seized it with both hands, demonstrating the qualities that would serve him well in the dangerous and lucrative years that lay ahead. The systematic construction of what would eventually become Sam Giancana's criminal empire began in the spring of 1926, when the young man who had so successfully demonstrated his capabilities in the South Side operation found himself entrusted with responsibilities that extended far beyond the execution of individual assignments. The Chicago outfit's leadership had recognized in Salvatore not merely a reliable soldier who could carry out orders with precision and discretion, but a natural organizer whose understanding of human nature and strategic thinking marked him as someone capable of building and managing complex criminal enterprises. The territory that was assigned to Salvatore's supervision encompassed a significant portion of Chicago's West Side, including neighborhoods that had been traditionally controlled by various smaller gangs and independent operators whose activities had never been effectively coordinated or systematically exploited. The challenge was not simply to impose the outfit's authority over these disparate criminal elements, but to transform them into components of a more efficient and profitable organizational structure that could generate steady revenues while minimizing the risks of law enforcement interference or violent confrontations with rival groups. The process of organizational development that Salvatore undertook during this period reflected both his natural intelligence and the lessons he had absorbed during his apprenticeship under more experienced criminals. He understood that lasting success in the underworld depended not on the kind of dramatic displays of violence that captured newspaper headlines, but rather on the patient construction of relationships, the careful cultivation of mutual dependencies, and the establishment of systems that could function effectively even when key personnel were temporarily unavailable due to imprisonment or other complications. His first priority was the identification and recruitment of individuals who possessed the specific qualities that successful criminal organizations required. These were not necessarily the most physically intimidating or violence-prone individuals available, though the capacity for violence remained an essential qualification, but rather men who demonstrated reliability, intelligence, and the psychological stability necessary to carry out complex assignments under pressure. Salvatore spent months interviewing potential recruits, evaluating their backgrounds, testing their reactions to stress, and assessing their compatibility with the organizational culture he was attempting to create. The recruitment process took place primarily in the informal settings where Chicago's criminal community gathered to conduct business and socialize. Pool halls, barbershops, and small restaurants served as venues where Salvatore could observe potential associates in relaxed circumstances, noting how they interacted with others, how they handled disputes, and whether they possessed the discretion and good judgment that criminal enterprises demanded. These observations were supplemented by careful inquiries among mutual acquaintances, creating detailed profiles of each candidate's strengths, weaknesses, and potential value to the organization. Tony Accardo emerged during this period as perhaps the most valuable of Salvatore's early recruits, a young man whose combination of intelligence, loyalty, and ruthless pragmatism would eventually make him one of the most important figures in Chicago organized crime. Accardo possessed the rare ability to think strategically about long term organizational goals while maintaining the attention to detail that ensured successful execution of immediate assignments. His background in the traditional Italian neighborhoods of Chicago had provided him with both the cultural foundation and the street level experience that Salvatore considered essential for positions of real responsibility. The organizational structure that Salvatore developed during this period reflected his understanding that criminal enterprises, like legitimate businesses, required clear hierarchies, defined responsibilities, and established procedures for communication and decision making. He created specialized roles within his growing organization, assigning different individuals to focus on particular aspects of the group's activities rather than expecting everyone to be competent in all areas of criminal endeavor. Some members of the organization specialized in what might be called customer relations, developing and maintaining the networks of contacts that were essential for the disposal of stolen goods, the collection of gambling debts, and the provision of protection services to legitimate businesses that operated in the organization's territory. These individuals required different skills from those who focused on operational activities, needing to project an image of respectability and trustworthiness that would reassure nervous clients while maintaining the subtle suggestion of consequences that might follow any failure to meet agreed upon obligations. Other members concentrated on intelligence gathering, systematically collecting information about law enforcement activities, rival organizations, and business opportunities that might be exploited. This intelligence function proved to be one of the most valuable aspects of the organization's operations, as advanced knowledge of police raids, rival gang activities, or changes in local political conditions could mean the difference between success and disaster in the dangerous world of organized crime. The territorial boundaries that defined the organization's area of operations were established through a combination of negotiation and intimidation that reflected Salvatore's understanding of the delicate balance between cooperation and competition that characterized relationships among criminal groups. Rather than attempting to seize control of all criminal activity within a given geographic area, which might have provoked unnecessary conflicts with established operators, he focused on identifying the most profitable opportunities and gradually expanding the organization's influence through strategic partnerships and carefully calculated displays of strength. The establishment of gambling operations represented one of the organization's most important early initiatives, as these activities provided both steady revenues and opportunities to develop relationships with customers who might prove useful in other contexts. The numbers racket, which allowed working class residents to place small bets on numerical combinations derived from various public sources, proved particularly profitable because it required minimal capital investment while generating substantial daily revenues that could be collected through an extensive network of neighborhood operators. The management of these gambling operations required sophisticated organizational capabilities, as the system involved hundreds of individual bettors, dozens of collectors, and multiple levels of supervision and accounting. Salvatore developed procedures for tracking bets, calculating payouts, and distributing profits that ensured both accuracy and security, while also creating multiple redundancies that allowed the system to continue functioning even when key personnel were unavailable due to arrest or other complications. The protection racket that the organization operated in conjunction with its gambling activities represented another significant source of both revenue and influence. Local businesses, ranging from small grocery stores to larger manufacturing concerns, were offered protection from theft, vandalism, and other forms of interference in exchange for regular payments that were calibrated according to the size and profitability of each enterprise. The beauty of this system lay in its apparent legitimacy, as the protection being offered was often genuine, and the services provided frequently included assistance with labor disputes, supplier problems, and other business challenges that extended beyond simple physical security. The development of relationships with law enforcement personnel represented perhaps the most delicate and crucial aspect of the organization's growth during this period. Salvatore understood that long term success in criminal enterprises required not just the avoidance of police attention, but the cultivation of cooperative relationships with officers, detectives, and supervisors who could provide advance warning of planned raids, influence the investigation of crimes, and ensure that arrested organization members received favorable treatment within the judicial system. These relationships were developed gradually and carefully, beginning with small favors and modest payments that established patterns of mutual benefit without creating the kinds of dramatic compromises that might attract attention from internal affairs, investigators, or reform minded prosecutors. The goal was to create situations where law enforcement personnel found it more profitable and convenient to cooperate with the organization than to oppose it, while maintaining sufficient discretion to protect both parties from the consequences of exposure. The winter months of 1926 and 1927 brought new challenges and opportunities as the organization's growing success began to attract attention from both rival criminal groups and law enforcement agencies. The increased visibility that came with success required adjustments to operational procedures and security measures that reflected the changing nature of the threats that the organization faced. Salvatore implemented communication protocols that reduced the risks associated with surveillance and infiltration, establishing procedures for meetings, telephone conversations, and written communications that minimize the possibility of creating evidence that could be used in criminal prosecutions. These security measures required all organization members to develop new habits and disciplines that sometimes conflicted with their natural inclinations toward casual interaction and spontaneous decision making. The financial management of the organization's growing revenues presented additional challenges that required systematic attention to accounting, tax considerations, and the laundering of illegal profits through legitimate business enterprises. Salvatore recognized that the organization's long term survival depended not just on its ability to generate profits, but on its capacity to disguise the sources of those profits and integrate them into the legitimate economy in ways that would not attract unwanted scrutiny. The establishment of legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for illegal activities became a priority during this period, as these enterprises provided both cover for criminal operations and vehicles for laundering illegal revenues. Small restaurants, construction companies, and import export businesses proved particularly suitable for these purposes, as their normal operations involved cash transactions, irregular schedules, and relationships with numerous suppliers and customers that could mask more questionable activities. As spring arrived in 1927, bringing warmer weather and new opportunities for expansion, Salvatore's organization had evolved from a loose collection of individual criminals into a sophisticated enterprise capable of conducting multiple types of illegal activities simultaneously while maintaining the security and efficiency that long term success required. The foundation had been laid for what would eventually become one of the most powerful and enduring criminal organizations in American history. The young man who had once helped his father sell vegetables from a pushcart now commanded the loyalty and respect of dozens of associates whose combined activities generated revenues that exceeded the annual profits of many legitimate businesses. The organizational skills that he had developed during this crucial period would serve him well in the increasingly complex and dangerous challenges that lay ahead, as his growing reputation and expanding influence inevitably brought him into conflict with rivals who viewed his success as a threat to their own ambitions and interests. The years following the successful consolidation of his Chicago territory presented Salvatore Giancana with opportunities for expansion that extended far beyond the familiar neighborhoods where he had first learned the fundamentals of organized crime. The late 1920s and early 1930s were a period of unprecedented growth in American criminal enterprises, as prohibition created enormous profit margins for illegal alcohol distribution, while the nation's expanding economy generated new opportunities for gambling, labor racketeering, and various forms of legitimate business infiltration. The strategic vision that guided Salvatore's expansion efforts reflected his understanding that lasting success in organized crime required diversification across multiple revenue streams and geographic regions. Rather than attempting to maximize profits from his existing operations, he chose to reinvest a significant portion of his earnings in ventures that would provide both immediate returns and long term strategic advantages. This approach distinguished him from many of his contemporaries, who often focused on short term gains without adequate consideration of the broader competitive landscape. The first major expansion initiative began in the spring of 1929 when Salvatore established operations in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a city whose proximity to Chicago and substantial immigrant population made it an attractive target for organized criminal activity. The Milwaukee venture required careful diplomatic negotiations with established local operators, as well as the development of new supply chains and distribution networks that could function effectively across state lines without attracting unwanted attention from federal law enforcement agencies. The choice of Milwaukee as an expansion target was based on detailed analysis of factors that included the city's economic characteristics, its political climate, and the competence of its existing criminal organizations. Milwaukee's economy was dominated by manufacturing industries that employed large numbers of European immigrants, creating a working class population that provided natural customers for gambling services and illegal alcohol. The city's political establishment had demonstrated a pragmatic tolerance for certain forms of vice, suggesting that properly managed criminal operations could function with minimal interference from local law enforcement. The organizational structure that Salvatore established in Milwaukee reflected lessons learned from his Chicago operations, but adapted to the specific challenges of managing criminal enterprises across geographic distances that made direct supervision difficult. He appointed trusted lieutenants to manage day to day operations while maintaining personal control over strategic decisions and financial oversight. Regular meetings were scheduled to ensure coordination between the Chicago and Milwaukee operations, with careful attention to security measures that would prevent law enforcement agencies from intercepting sensitive communications. The success of the Milwaukee expansion encouraged Salvatore to consider even more ambitious geographic ventures, including operations in cities as distant as Kansas City, Missouri, and parts of southern Illinois, where his organization's reputation and resources could provide competitive advantages over local criminal groups. These ventures required the development of sophisticated logistics capabilities, as the movement of personnel, money, and illegal goods across multiple state lines created complex operational challenges that had to be resolved without creating vulnerabilities that competitors or law enforcement agencies might exploit. The expansion into legitimate business enterprises represented another crucial aspect of Salvatore's strategic development during this period. He recognized that criminal organizations needed legal sources of income that could provide cover for illegal activities, while also generating profits that did not depend on the continued tolerance of law enforcement agencies. The businesses he selected for acquisition or partnership were chosen for their compatibility with existing criminal operations and their potential for providing long-term financial security. The restaurant and catering business proved particularly attractive for these purposes, as it offered opportunities for money laundering, provided meeting places that appeared entirely legitimate, and generated cash revenues that could be easily manipulated for tax purposes. Salvatore acquired interests in several Chicago area restaurants during this period, carefully maintaining the appearance of normal business operations while using these establishments to support his criminal activities in ways that were virtually impossible for outsiders to detect. The construction industry offered different but equally valuable opportunities for legitimate business development. Construction companies provided natural covers for the movement of personnel and equipment that might be needed for criminal operations, while also offering opportunities to exercise influence over labor unions and municipal contracting processes. The seasonal nature of construction work created flexibility that could be exploited for criminal purposes, as workers who were nominally employed by construction companies could be temporarily assigned to other activities when building projects were inactive. The development of relationships with labor unions represented one of the most significant strategic initiatives that Salvatore undertook during this expansion period. Labor organizations controlled access to employment in many industries, possessed substantial financial resources through pension funds and dues collections, and wielded political influence that could be extremely valuable for criminal enterprises that needed protection from law enforcement interference. The process of establishing these relationships required patience, discretion, and considerable financial investment, but the long-term benefits justified the substantial commitment of resources. The trucking industry became a particular focus of Salvatore's labor-related activities, as control over transportation workers provided opportunities to influence the movement of both legal and illegal goods throughout the Chicago metropolitan area. The Teamsters Union, which represented drivers and warehouse workers, proved especially receptive to the kind of mutually beneficial arrangements that Salvatore preferred to establish with legitimate organizations. These relationships provided his criminal enterprises with reliable transportation services while offering union leadership, financial, and political support that enhanced their own positions within the labor movement. The stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent economic depression created both challenges and opportunities for Salvatore's expanding criminal empire. The widespread financial hardship that characterized the early 1930s increased demand for gambling services and illegal alcohol and dye as people sought both escapism and the possibility of quick financial gains that might alleviate their economic problems. At the same time, the general reduction in legitimate economic activity created opportunities for criminal organizations to acquire businesses and real estate at substantially reduced prices. The Depression also affected the competitive landscape within organized crime itself, as some criminal enterprises found themselves unable to maintain their operations without the economic prosperity that had sustained them during the 1920s. Salvatore was able to take advantage of these difficulties by acquiring the assets and territories of failing competitors, often through negotiations that were far less violent than the consolidation campaigns that had characterized his earlier territorial expansion. The development of casino operations in various locations outside of Illinois represented one of the most ambitious aspects of Salvatore's expansion strategy during this period. These ventures required substantial capital investments and sophisticated management capabilities, as casino operations were more complex than traditional gambling activities like numbers running or sports betting. The casinos also attracted more affluent customers, whose patronage provided both higher profit margins and valuable networking opportunities that could be exploited for other business purposes. The Hot Springs, Arkansas casino venture, which began operations in 1931, exemplified the sophisticated approach that Salvatore brought to this type of expansion. Hot Springs was already established as a resort destination that attracted wealthy visitors from throughout the South and Midwest, and the city's political leadership had demonstrated a tolerant attitude toward gambling activities that made it an ideal location for casino development. The operation was structured as a partnership with local interests, providing both political protection and operational expertise while allowing Salvatore's organization to maintain effective control over the most profitable aspects of the business. The success of the Hot Springs venture led to similar casino developments in other resort locations, including areas of Nevada where gambling was legal and the regulatory environment was more predictable than in most other states. These Nevada operations would eventually prove to be among the most valuable components of Salvatore's criminal empire, as they provided opportunities for money laundering on an enormous scale while generating substantial, legitimate income that enhanced the organization's overall financial stability. The expansion into narcotics trafficking represented a more controversial aspect of Salvatore's business development during this period. While some members of his organization were reluctant to become involved in drug dealing because of the severe penalties associated with such crimes and the social stigma attached to narcotics trafficking, Salvatore recognized that the profit margins in this area were too substantial to ignore. The approach he developed attempted to minimize the organization's direct exposure while still capturing a significant share of the revenues that drug trafficking generated. Rather than engaging directly in street level drug sales, Salvatore's organization focused on providing protection and logistical support to independent drug dealers in exchange for substantial percentages of their profits. This approach reduced the legal risks while still allowing the organization to benefit from the enormous revenues that narcotics trafficking generated during the Depression years, when many people turned to drugs as an escape from economic hardship and social dislocation. The international connections that Salvatore developed during this expansion period proved to be among the most valuable long term assets that his organization acquired. Relationships with criminal groups in Sicily, southern France, and various Latin American countries provided access to smuggling networks that could handle both alcohol and narcotics, while also offering potential refuges in case legal difficulties made it necessary for organization members to leave the United States temporarily. As the 1930s progressed and the repeal of prohibition began to seem inevitable, Salvatore demonstrated the strategic foresight that had characterized his earlier business development by beginning to shift his organization's focus toward criminal activities that would remain profitable even after alcohol became legal again. The expansion initiatives that he had undertaken during the Prohibition years had created a diversified criminal empire that was well positioned to adapt to changing legal and economic conditions. The foundation had been laid for what would eventually become one of the most powerful and enduring criminal organizations in American history, with operations extending from Chicago to Las Vegas, from labor unions to legitimate businesses, from local gambling operations to international smuggling networks. The young man who had once stolen coal to heat his family's tenement apartment had evolved into the leader of a criminal enterprise whose influence and resources rivaled those of many legitimate corporations and political organizations. The systematic corruption of Chicago's political and law enforcement establishments represented perhaps the most sophisticated and crucial aspect of Salvatore Giancana's criminal enterprise during the early 1930s. As his organization had expanded beyond the relatively simple territorial disputes and direct competition that characterized his earlier career, he had come to understand that long term success in organized crime required not merely the ability to evade law enforcement, but the capacity to influence and control the very institutions that were supposedly designed to prevent criminal activity. The approach that Salvatore developed toward corruption was characterized by the same methodical intelligence that had distinguished his earlier business ventures. Rather than relying on crude bribery or dramatic confrontations with authority figures, he recognized that lasting influence required the cultivation of relationships based on mutual benefit and shared interests. The goal was not to purchase temporary cooperation from individual officials, but to create systematic dependencies that would ensure reliable protection for his criminal activities while advancing the legitimate careers and personal interests of his collaborators. The process of identifying potential targets for corruption began with careful analysis of Chicago's political and administrative structure, focusing particularly on individuals whose official responsibilities intersected with areas of criminal activity that generated substantial revenues for the organization. Police commanders responsible for vice enforcement, prosecutors who handled organized crime cases, judges who sentenced convicted criminals, and municipal officials who controlled licensing and regulatory processes, all represented high priority targets whose cooperation could provide enormous strategic advantages. The initial contact with potential targets was typically made through intermediaries who could approach officials without creating obvious connections to criminal activities. These intermediaries were often legitimate businessmen or professional politicians who maintained relationships with both the criminal organization and the targeted officials, allowing them to serve as bridges between two worlds that were supposedly separate but increasingly interdependent in the complex urban environment of Depression era Chicago. Captain Thomas Malone of the Chicago Police Department's Central District represented one of the most valuable early acquisitions in Salvatore's corruption campaign. Malone was a 20-year veteran of the force, whose district included several of the organization's most profitable gambling operations, making his cooperation essential for the continued success of these ventures. The approach to Malone was made through a series of seemingly innocent social contacts that gradually evolved into a relationship of mutual dependency and shared profit. The initial overture came through Malone's brother in law, who owned a small restaurant that had been struggling financially during the early years of the Depression. The restaurant received a series of increasingly generous loans from what appeared to be a legitimate business association, but which was actually funded by Salvatore's organization. When the restaurant began to show improved profits, thanks partly to an influx of customers who were actually organization members and associates, Malone naturally became curious about the source of his brother in law's sudden good fortune. The subsequent development of the relationship with Malone followed a carefully orchestrated pattern that avoided any direct discussion of criminal activities or corrupt arrangements, while creating increasingly compelling reasons for the police captain to ignore certain types of illegal activity within his district. Social invitations led to informal business discussions, which evolved into opportunities for Malone to provide investment advice and eventually to participate directly in various business ventures that generated substantial profits with remarkably little apparent risk. The beauty of this approach was that Malone could honestly claim, even to himself, that he was not accepting bribes or engaging in corrupt practices. He was simply participating in legitimate business opportunities that had been offered to him by successful entrepreneurs who valued his judgment and experience. The fact that these business opportunities consistently produced excellent returns while requiring minimal time or expertise on his part might have seemed suspicious to a more cynical observer, but Malone chose to attribute his good fortune to his own business acumen and the natural rewards of hard work and honest service. The corruption of judicial officials required even more sophisticated techniques, as judges and prosecutors were generally more educated and legally sophisticated than police officers, making them potentially more resistant to crude approaches while also being more valuable targets whose cooperation could provide extraordinary benefits. The key to successful judicial corruption lay in understanding that most legal professionals were motivated by career ambitions and social status at least as much as by immediate financial considerations. Judge William Patterson, who presided over the criminal court where many organization members faced trial, became a crucial ally through an approach that focused on his political aspirations rather than his immediate financial needs. Patterson harbored ambitions for higher judicial office, possibly even a federal appointment, but lacked the political connections and financial resources necessary to mount successful campaigns for such positions. The organization was able to provide both the political support and the campaign financing that Patterson needed, in exchange for his cooperation in ensuring favorable outcomes for organization members who appeared in his courtroom. The assistance provided to Patterson was carefully structured to appear entirely legitimate, consisting of introductions to influential political figures, invitations to social events where he could network with potential supporters, and contributions to his political campaigns that were made through apparently independent sources. The favorable treatment that organization members received in Patterson's courtroom could be attributed to his judicial discretion and his belief in rehabilitation rather than punishment, philosophical positions that were entirely consistent with his public statements about criminal justice reform. The development of relationships with municipal officials who controlled business licensing, zoning decisions, and regulatory enforcement required different techniques that reflected the practical nature of these officials' responsibilities and their generally more direct involvement in the day to day business activities of the city. These officials were often more receptive to straightforward financial arrangements, as their decisions directly affected business operations and could be rationalized as efforts to promote economic development and job creation. Alderman James Russo, whose ward included several of the organization's legitimate business fronts, became a valuable ally through arrangements that provided him with substantial consulting fees for advice on zoning matters and business development strategies. The fees were paid by a series of apparently independent businesses, making it difficult for outside observers to trace the payments to their actual source or to demonstrate that Russo's advice had any connection to criminal activities. The consulting arrangement with Russo provided the organization with advance notice of planned regulatory changes, assistance in obtaining favorable zoning decisions for legitimate business ventures, and protection from harassment by municipal inspectors who might otherwise have created problems for organization controlled enterprises. In return, Russo received income that substantially exceeded his official salary while also gaining access to business opportunities and political support that enhanced his own position within the city's democratic political machine. The corruption of federal officials presented both greater challenges and greater potential rewards, as federal law enforcement agencies possess jurisdiction over many of the organization's most profitable activities, including interstate transportation of illegal goods and tax evasion. The approach to federal corruption required even more sophisticated techniques and substantially greater financial resources, but the protection it provided was correspondingly more valuable and comprehensive. The cultivation of relationships within the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Chicago office began with careful analysis of the personal and professional situations of individual agents, focusing particularly on those whose financial circumstances or career ambitions created potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The approach was necessarily indirect, often beginning with social contacts through seemingly unrelated, legitimate activities such as golf clubs, neighborhood associations, or charitable organizations. Agent Robert Morrison, who specialized in organized crime investigations, became a particularly valuable source of information through a relationship that began when his son required expensive medical treatment for a serious illness. The treatment costs placed enormous financial strain on Morrison's family, creating a situation that the organization was able to address through what appeared to be generous assistance from a charitable foundation. The foundation, which was actually controlled by the organization, provided not only immediate financial assistance, but also ongoing support that helped to ensure Morrison's continued cooperation. The information that Morrison provided proved invaluable in allowing the organization to anticipate federal investigations, modify its operational procedures to avoid detection, and identify potential informants within the criminal community who might pose threats to organizational security. This intelligence was often more valuable than direct protection from prosecution, as it allowed the organization to prevent problems before they developed into serious threats. The systematic corruption of Chicago's authority structure during this period created what amounted to a parallel government that served the organization's interests while maintaining the appearance of normal democratic institutions. Police ignored certain types of criminal activity. Prosecutors declined to pursue cases that might threaten organization interests. Judges imposed lenient sentences on organization members, and municipal officials ensured that legitimate business fronts operated without regulatory interference. The financial cost of maintaining these corrupt relationships was substantial, requiring the organization to dedicate a significant percentage of its revenues to payments that might not produce immediate tangible benefits, but were essential for long-term security and operational freedom. The investment was justified by the enormous reduction in legal risks and operational disruptions that comprehensive corruption provided, allowing the organization to conduct its criminal activities with a level of confidence and efficiency that would have been impossible in a more hostile legal environment. The psychological impact of successful corruption extended beyond its practical benefits, as the knowledge that supposedly legitimate authority figures were actually allies and collaborators provided organization members with a sense of invulnerability that enhanced their effectiveness and loyalty. The realization that the boundary between legitimate and illegitimate authority was far more permeable than most citizens understood served to validate the organization's worldview and justify its continued expansion into areas that might otherwise have seemed too risky to attempt. As the 1930s progressed and the organization's corrupt network expanded to include officials at every level of government, from beat patrolmen to federal judges, Salvatore had created a protective infrastructure that would serve as the foundation for even more ambitious criminal ventures. The corruption of authority had become not merely a defensive strategy designed to prevent prosecution, but an offensive weapon that could be used to eliminate competitors, gather intelligence about potential threats, and create new opportunities for profitable criminal activity. The success of this corruption campaign would prove to be one of Salvatore's most enduring achievements, creating relationships and dependencies that would protect his organization for decades to come while establishing him as one of the most powerful figures in American organized crime. The years between 1945 and 1960 represented the pinnacle of Sam Giancana's power and influence, a period when the criminal empire he had so methodically constructed reached its full maturity and commanded respect that extended far beyond the boundaries of traditional organized crime. The man who had once been known simply as Salvatore on the streets of Chicago's Little Italy now carried the nickname Momo with an authority that was recognized from the boardrooms of Las Vegas casinos to the inner circles of American NRA. Political power. The daily routine that governed Sam's life during this peak period reflected both the extraordinary scope of his responsibilities and the careful attention to security that had become essential for someone of his prominence and notoriety. His primary residence was a modest but elegant home in the Oak Park suburb of Chicago, chosen not for ostentation, but for its strategic location that provided both privacy and convenient access to the various centers of his legitimate and illegitimate business activities. The morning ritual that began each day typically started at 7:30 with a carefully prepared breakfast served in the dining room that overlooked a meticulously maintained garden where Sam often spent quiet moments contemplating the complex decisions that awaited him. The newspapers that accompanied his morning coffee were read with the systematic attention of a military commander studying intelligence reports, as information about political developments, business trends, and law enforcement activities could all have immediate implications for his far reaching operations. The telephone conversations that occupied much of his morning hours were conducted in a mixture of English, Italian, and coded language that reflected both his cultural background and the security concerns that governed all communications within his organization. These calls connected him with associates in cities across the United States and occasionally overseas, as his influence had expanded to encompass relationships with criminal organizations, legitimate businesses, and political figures whose cooperation was essential for maintaining the complex web of activities that generated his enormous wealth and power. The office building on North Michigan Avenue that served as the headquarters for several of Sam's legitimate business enterprises provided a respectable facade for meetings with associates whose activities might not bear close scrutiny from law enforcement agencies. The building's marble floored lobby and well appointed conference rooms created an atmosphere of corporate respectability that masked the true nature of many of the discussions that took place within its walls. The afternoon hours were often devoted to meetings with the various categories of individuals whose cooperation was essential for the continued success of his empire. Legitimate businessmen sought his assistance in resolving labor disputes, obtaining favorable treatment from municipal agencies, or gaining access to capital for expansion projects. Labor union leaders discussed contracts, pension fund investments, and political campaigns that could benefit from his support. Politicians at every level of government, from local aldermen to members of Congress, came to seek his advice on matters ranging from campaign strategy to policy positions that might affect his business interests. The evening entertainment that had become an integral part of Sam's lifestyle during this period reflected his understanding that social relationships were as important as business relationships in maintaining his position of influence and authority. The dinner parties at his Oak Park residence brought together an eclectic mixture of guests that might include federal judges, movie stars, labor leaders, and successful businessmen whose only common characteristic was their recognition of Sam's importance and their desire to maintain favorable relationships with him. The restaurants where Sam regularly dined were carefully selected not only for their culinary excellence, but also for their suitability as meeting places where sensitive business could be conducted without attracting unwanted attention. The proprietors of these establishments understood the importance of discretion and were rewarded for their cooperation with protection from various forms of interference and occasional assistance with business problems that might arise. The entertainment venues that Sam frequented or controlled provided both profitable business opportunities and valuable networking possibilities. The nightclubs and lounges where he was regularly seen served as informal communications centers where information could be exchanged, relationships could be cultivated, and the subtle negotiations that characterized much of his business activity could be conducted in relaxed social settings. The Cal Neva Lodge at Lake Tahoe represented perhaps the most visible symbol of Sam's legitimate business success during this period. This resort property, which straddled the California Nevada border and attracted wealthy visitors from throughout the western United States, provided opportunities for money laundering, high stakes gambling, and the kind of celebrity associations that enhanced Sam's social status while providing cover for more questionable activities. The performers and entertainers who appeared at Cal Neva and other venues associated with Sam's organization were carefully selected not only for their ability to attract customers, but also for their potential value as sources of information and influence within the entertainment industry. The relationships that developed between Sam's organization and various celebrities created networks of mutual obligation that could be exploited for both business and political purposes. The Las Vegas operations that had become increasingly central to Sam's empire during the 1950s represented the perfect synthesis of legitimate business success and criminal enterprise. The casinos in which his organization held interests generated enormous revenues through legal gambling activities, while also providing ideal facilities for money laundering, political entertaining, and the cultivation of relationships with wealthy and influential individuals from throughout the country. The hotel and restaurant operations associated with these Las Vegas ventures required sophisticated management capabilities that demonstrated Sam's evolution from street level criminal to legitimate business executive. The ability to oversee complex service operations, manage large staffs, and maintain the kind of customer service standards that attracted repeat business from discriminating clientele represented skills that would have been valuable in any legitimate industry. The political influence that Sam wielded during this peak period extended from local Chicago politics to the highest levels of national government. His organization's ability to deliver votes, provide campaign financing, and influence labor union positions on various issues made him a valuable ally for politicians whose success often depended on the kind of support that only well organized criminal enterprises could provide reliably and discreetly. The relationship between Sam's organization and various agencies of the federal government during this period reflected the complex and sometimes contradictory nature of American law enforcement and intelligence activities during the Cold War era. While the Federal Bureau of Investigation maintained official opposition to organized crime activities, other government agencies occasionally found it convenient to cooperate with criminal organizations whose resources and international connections could be useful for intelligence gathering and covert operations. The wealth that Sam accumulated during this period was enormous by any standard, consisting not only of liquid assets that could be quickly accessed, but also extensive real estate holdings, business investments, and various forms of personal property that provided both financial security and social status. The careful management of these assets required the services of accountants, lawyers, and investment advisors whose discretion was as important as their technical competence. The lifestyle that this wealth supported was comfortable but not ostentatious, reflecting Sam's understanding that excessive displays of luxury might attract unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies or create resentment among associates whose cooperation was essential for his continued success. The emphasis was on quality rather than quantity, with careful attention to details that reflected sophisticated taste and cultural refinement. The personal relationships that Sam maintained during this period were characterized by the same careful calculation that governed his business activities. His marriage and family life were conducted with attention to conventional respectability, providing him with the kind of domestic stability that enhanced his social standing while also creating potential vulnerabilities that he had to protect through various security measures. The social circle that surrounded Sam during his peak years included individuals whose own success and influence reinforced his position while providing him with access to information and opportunities that might not otherwise have been available. These relationships were maintained through a complex system of mutual favors, shared investments, and social obligations that created networks of interdependence extending throughout legitimate and illegitimate society. The respect that Sam commanded during this period was based not only on fear of his capacity for violence, though that reputation remained an important foundation of his authority, but also on recognition of his intelligence, reliability, and ability to deliver on promises and commitments. This respect extended beyond the criminal community to include legitimate businessmen, politicians, and even law enforcement officials who recognized his competence and influence even while officially opposing his activities. The decision making process that governed Sam's daily activities during this peak period involved careful consideration of factors that extended far beyond immediate profit considerations. The potential long term consequences of various actions, the impact on relationships with key allies and associates, and the possible reactions from law enforcement agencies all had to be weighed in, making choices that could affect not only his own interests, but also the welfare of the hundreds of individuals whose livelihoods depended on his organization's continued success. As the 1950s drew to a close and new challenges began to emerge from changing political conditions and increased law enforcement pressure, Sam's position at the peak of American organized crime represented the culmination of a remarkable transformation from immigrant poverty to extraordinary power and influence. The foundation had been laid for what would prove to be an increasingly difficult period, as the very success that had elevated him to such prominence would inevitably attract the attention of enemies and competitors who viewed his power as a threat to their own ambitions and interests. The extraordinary power and wealth that Sam Giancana had accumulated by the late 1950s came with personal costs that were largely invisible to the outside world, but increasingly difficult to ignore within the private spaces, where he attempted to maintain some semblance of normal human relationships. The man who commanded absolute authority over a criminal empire that spanned multiple states and generated millions of dollars in annual revenues found himself increasingly isolated from the simple human connections that provide meaning and comfort to most people's lives. The relationship with his wife Angeline, who had married him in 1933 when he was still a rising figure within the Chicago outfit rather than its acknowledged leader, had become strained by the constant security concerns and public scrutiny that accompanied his growing notoriety. Angeline had adapted to the unusual circumstances of being married to one of America's most powerful criminals with remarkable grace and resilience. But the psychological toll of living under constant threat and maintaining elaborate deceptions about her husband's activities had created an emotional distance that no amount of wealth or luxury could bridge. The dinner conversations at the Giancana household in Oak Park, which had once provided Sam with a refuge from the tensions and complexities of his criminal activities, had gradually evolved into carefully orchestrated performances where family members unconsciously censored their remarks to avoid topics that might create problems or remind everyone present of the dangerous realities that governed their problems. daily existence. The spontaneous affection and casual intimacy that characterize healthy family relationships had been replaced by a kind of formal politeness that protected everyone involved while preventing the development of genuine emotional connections. Angeline's declining health during the 1950s added another layer of complexity to an already difficult domestic situation. The stress of maintaining the public facade required by her husband's position, combined with the constant anxiety about his safety and the welfare of their three daughters, had manifested itself in a series of physical ailments that required increasingly frequent medical attention. The irony that Sam could command the finest medical care that money could buy while being unable to address the underlying causes of his wife's suffering was not lost on either of them. The three Giancana daughters, Antoinette, Bonnie, and Francine, represented perhaps the most painful aspect of the personal costs that Sam's criminal career had exacted. As they had grown from children into young women during the 1940s and 50s, they had been forced to navigate the complex social terrain of being the daughters of a notorious crime boss while attempting to maintain some degree of normal adolescent and young adult experiences. Antoinette, the eldest daughter, had developed a fierce protective instinct regarding her family's privacy and reputation that manifested itself in an almost militant discretion about her father's activities and associates. She had learned to deflect questions about her family with practiced ease, but the constant vigilance required to maintain this protective stance had left her with a guardedness that extended to all of her personal relationships. The natural trust and openness that should characterize relationships between parents and children had been replaced by an unspoken understanding that certain subjects were never to be discussed. The social isolation that the family experienced was perhaps most evident in the girls' school and social activities. While Sam's wealth ensured that his daughters attended the finest private schools and participated in exclusive social organizations, the other parents and students were always aware of the family's background, creating an atmosphere of polite distance that prevented the development of genuine friendships. The girls learned early that their father's reputation preceded them wherever they went, making it impossible for them to be judged on their own merits or to form relationships that were not influenced by the complex mixture of fear, fascination, and disapproval that their surname evoked. The romantic relationships that the daughters attempted to pursue as they reached adulthood presented additional complications that reflected the unique challenges of being connected to one of America's most notorious criminals. The young men who were attracted to them often seemed more interested in the excitement and danger associated with their family name than in their individual personalities and qualities. Those who were genuinely interested in building serious relationships frequently found themselves overwhelmed by the security concerns and family obligations that came with involvement in the Giancana family circle. Sam's relationship with his own extended family had also been profoundly affected by his criminal career and growing notoriety. His elderly parents, Antonio and Maria, who still lived in the old neighborhood where Sam had grown up, found themselves subjected to constant attention from law enforcement agencies, news reporters, and curious neighbors who hoped to gain insight into the private life of their famous son. The simple dignity that had characterized their lives as hard-working immigrants had been replaced by a kind of celebrity that they neither wanted nor understood. The visits that Sam made to his parents' modest home became increasingly infrequent and carefully orchestrated events that required extensive security precautions and caused significant disruption to the neighborhood. The spontaneous family gatherings that had once provided him with connections to his cultural roots and personal history were no longer possible, as his presence inevitably attracted unwanted attention that put both his family and innocent neighbors at risk. The health problems that began to manifest themselves in Sam's own life during this period were likely related to the enormous stress and constant vigilance that his position required. The careful attention to diet, exercise, and medical care that his wealth made possible could not entirely compensate for the psychological toll of living under constant threat while managing an enterprise that involved life and death decisions on a regular basis. The headaches, digestive problems, and sleep disorders that increasingly plagued him were symptoms of a lifestyle that demanded more of the human nervous system than it was designed to withstand. The sleep that had once provided Sam with respite from his daily concerns had become fitful and frequently interrupted by the kind of hypervigilance that develops in individuals who must constantly be prepared for threats from multiple sources. The elaborate security measures that protected his home and family also served as constant reminders of the dangers that surrounded them, making it impossible to achieve the kind of complete relaxation that is necessary for genuine rest and psychological recovery. The social relationships that Sam maintained outside his immediate family were characterized by the same mixture of genuine affection and calculated self interest that governed all aspects of his life during this period. The friends and associates who surrounded him were bound to him by complex webs of obligation, shared interests, and mutual dependency that made it difficult to distinguish between authentic personal connections and professional relationships that masqueraded as friendship. The entertainment and cultural activities that provided Sam with opportunities for relaxation and personal expression had become complicated by his public notoriety and the constant presence of law enforcement surveillance. The restaurants, nightclubs, and social gatherings that he attended were inevitably monitored by federal agents, making spontaneous enjoyment difficult and turning even recreational activities into potential sources of legal problems for both him and his associates. The philosophical reflections that occupied increasing amounts of Sam's private time during this period revealed a man who was acutely aware of the contradictions and compromises that his chosen path had required. The wealth and power that he had accumulated through decades of careful planning and ruthless execution had provided him with material comforts and social influence that exceeded his wildest childhood dreams, but they had also cut him off from many of the human experiences that provide life with its deepest meaning and satisfaction. The legacy that Sam was creating for his children and grandchildren represented another source of private concern that he rarely discussed with even his closest associates. While his criminal activities had provided his family with financial security that would last for generations, they had also burdened them with a reputation and a set of associations that would follow them throughout their lives. The name Giancana would always evoke memories of organized crime and violence, making it difficult for his descendants to escape the shadow of his choices and achievements. The religious faith that had been an important part of Sam's childhood and early adult years had become increasingly complicated by the obvious contradictions between Catholic moral teachings and the realities of his criminal career. While he continued to attend Mass occasionally and maintained relationships with several priests who served the Italian community, the comfort and guidance that religion might have provided were compromised by his awareness that his lifestyle was fundamentally incompatible with the spiritual values he had been taught to respect. The charitable activities that Sam supported during this period represented perhaps his most genuine attempt to create some positive legacy that might balance the negative consequences of his criminal activities. The donations to hospitals, schools, and community organizations were made quietly and without publicity, suggesting that they reflected authentic concern for the welfare of others rather than calculated attempts to improve his public image. As the 1950s drew to a close and new challenges began to emerge from changing political conditions and increased law enforcement pressure, the personal costs of Sam's extraordinary success had created a complex psychological landscape that combined enormous pride in his achievements with growing awareness of what those achievements had required him to sacrifice. The young man who had once dreamed of escaping the poverty and powerlessness of his immigrant childhood had succeeded beyond his wildest imagination, but the price of that success had been paid primarily by those he loved most. The crisis that would define Sam Giancana's reputation as one of America's most ruthless criminal leaders began to develop during the winter months of 1957, when a series of challenges to his authority created a situation that could not be resolved through the diplomatic negotiations and financial arrangements that had characterized most of his previous conflicts. The convergence of internal betrayals, external threats, and law enforcement pressure created a perfect storm that would require the kind of decisive violence that had always been the ultimate foundation of power in the world of organized crime. The immediate catalyst for the crisis was the growing ambition of several Chicago outfit members who had begun to question whether Sam's leadership was still serving the organization's best interests. These challenges were not motivated by simple greed or personal animosity, but by genuine strategic disagreements about how the organization should adapt to the changing legal and political environment of the late 1950s. The increasing attention from federal law enforcement agencies, combined with new investigative techniques that made traditional criminal activities more dangerous, had created tensions within the organization that could no longer be ignored. Anthony Accardo, who had served as Sam's most trusted lieutenant for more than 20 years, found himself caught between his personal loyalty to Sam and his growing concern that the organization's high-profile activities were attracting the kind of sustained law enforcement attention that could ultimately destroy everything they had built together. Accardo's reputation for strategic thinking and careful judgment made his reservations particularly significant, as other organization members looked to him for guidance on how to navigate the increasingly complex challenges they faced. The specific incident that transformed these underlying tensions into open conflict occurred on a cold February evening at a restaurant on North Clark Street, where Sam was meeting with several associates to discuss the expansion of gambling operations into new suburban territories. The conversation had proceeded normally until one of the participants, a longtime organization member named Frank Esposito, directly questioned Sam's judgment regarding a recent business decision that had resulted in significant financial losses and unwanted publicity. Esposito's challenge was not delivered in the heated language of personal confrontation, but rather in the measured tones of someone who believed he was offering constructive criticism that would help the organization avoid future problems. The suggestion that Sam's leadership might be fallible, however, struck at the fundamental assumptions about authority and respect that held the organization together, creating a moment of tension that everyone present understood could not be allowed to pass without some form of decisive response. The silence that followed Esposito's remarks was filled with the kind of electric tension that develops when men who have spent their lives in violent enterprises recognize that they are approaching a point of no return. The other participants in the meeting carefully avoided making eye contact with either Sam or Esposito, understanding that their own survival might depend on their ability to remain neutral in whatever conflict was about to unfold. Sam's response to Esposito's challenge was notable for its restraint and apparent reasonableness, as he calmly acknowledged the validity of the concerns that had been raised, while making it clear that he intended to address them in his own way and on his own timeline. The meeting concluded without any dramatic confrontation, but everyone present understood that the fundamental relationship between Sam and Esposito had been irreparably altered by the exchange that had just occurred. The planning process that followed this confrontation revealed the methodical approach to violence that had always characterized Sam's leadership style. Rather than responding immediately in anger or allowing the situation to escalate through a series of increasingly heated exchanges, he chose to address the challenge to his authority in a manner that would send the clearest possible message to other organization members, while minimizing the risk of creating additional problems with law enforcement or rival criminal groups. The intelligence gathering that preceded any action against Esposito was conducted with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized all of Sam's major operations. Esposito's daily routines were studied, his associates were identified and evaluated, and the potential consequences of various courses of action were carefully analyzed. The goal was not simply to eliminate a problem, but to do so in a way that would strengthen Sam's position within the organization while demonstrating his continued capacity for decisive leadership. The operation itself was planned for a warm evening in late May, when Esposito would be attending a regular card game at a social club on the west side. The location was chosen because it provided both accessibility and a controlled environment where the action could be carried out with minimal risk of interference from innocent bystanders or law enforcement agencies. The timing was selected to ensure that the psychological impact would be maximized while the practical disruption to organization activities would be minimized. The team that carried out the elimination consisted of 3 carefully selected organization members whose loyalty to Sam was unquestioned and whose competence in such matters had been proven through previous operations. The selection process reflected Sam's understanding that successful violence required not just physical courage, but also the psychological stability and professional judgment that would ensure the operation was completed according to plan without creating unnecessary complications. The execution of the operation proceeded with the precision that had become the hallmark of Sam's approach to organizational discipline. Esposito was eliminated quickly and efficiently, in a manner that left no doubt about the reason for his death, while avoiding the kind of theatrical violence that might have attracted unwanted media attention or provoked law enforcement agencies to launch intensive investigations. The psychological impact of Esposito's elimination extended far beyond the immediate message it sent to other potential challengers within the organization. Word of the incident spread quickly throughout Chicago's criminal community, reinforcing Sam's reputation as a leader who would not tolerate challenges to his authority, regardless of the personal relationships or past services that might be involved. The elimination served as a reminder that loyalty and respect were not just philosophical concepts, but practical necessities that could have life and death consequences. The weeks that followed brought additional challenges that tested Sam's resolve and demonstrated the cascading effects that major acts of violence can have within criminal organizations. Several associates who had been close to Esposito began to distance themselves from the organization, either through voluntary retirement from active participation or through more permanent relocations to other cities where they hoped to avoid being caught up in whatever additional violence might follow. The law enforcement response to Esposito's death was more intensive than Sam had anticipated, as federal agents used the incident as justification for expanding their surveillance and investigation of Chicago outfit activities. The increased attention created operational difficulties that required modifications to established procedures and the temporary suspension of certain activities that had been generating substantial revenues for the organization. The internal dynamics of the organization were also affected in ways that were not immediately apparent but would have long term consequences for Sam's leadership. While the elimination of Esposito had successfully reasserted his authority and discouraged other potential challenges, it had also created an atmosphere of heightened tension and suspicion that made it more difficult for organization members to maintain the kinds of open communication and collaborative relationships that effective criminal enterprises required. The crisis was further complicated by external threats from rival organizations that saw the internal turmoil within the Chicago outfit as an opportunity to encroach on territory and business activities that had previously been considered off limits. These challenges required Sam to divide his attention between maintaining internal discipline and defending against external threats, creating additional stress on an organization that was already dealing with increased law enforcement pressure. The resolution of these multiple crises required Sam to demonstrate not just his capacity for decisive violence, but also his ability to rebuild organizational cohesion and external relationships that had been damaged by the recent turmoil. The process involved a combination of strategic eliminations, diplomatic negotiations, and financial incentives that gradually restored stability while establishing new boundaries and expectations for future behavior. The most significant external challenge came from elements within the New York crime families who had begun to question whether the Chicago outfit remained a reliable partner for various interstate criminal ventures. These concerns were based partly on the increased law enforcement attention that Chicago operations were attracting and partly on perceptions that Sam's leadership style was creating instability that might affect collaborative arrangements. The response to these external challenges required Sam to orchestrate a series of meetings with representatives from other crime families, demonstrating that the recent internal difficulties had not weakened the Chicago outfit's capacity for effective action or its commitment to maintaining established territorial agreements and business relationships. These negotiations were conducted with the same careful attention to protocol and mutual respect that characterized diplomatic relations between sovereign nations. The final resolution of the crisis came through a dramatic demonstration of the Chicago outfit's continued strength and unity as Sam organized a coordinated response to several specific challenges that had been testing the organization's resolve. The operation involved simultaneous actions in multiple cities, requiring a level of planning and coordination that impressed both allies and enemies, while sending a clear message about the consequences of underestimating Sam's leadership capabilities. The aftermath of this period of violence and crisis left Sam's position within organized crime stronger than it had been before the challenges began, but it also marked a turning point in his relationship with law enforcement agencies that would have profound consequences for his future operations. The decisive manner in which he had resolved internal and external threats had demonstrated his continued effectiveness as a leader, but it had also elevated his profile in ways that would make it increasingly difficult for him to operate with the relative anonymity that had previously protected his activities. As the summer of 1957 drew to a close and the organization settled into new routines that reflected the lessons learned during the recent crisis, Sam had successfully navigated one of the most challenging periods of his criminal career while establishing his reputation as a leader whose authority was absolute and whose capacity for violence was limited only by strategic considerations rather than personal restraint. The transformation of Sam Giancana from a shadowy criminal figure, known primarily within law enforcement circles, to a household name throughout America began in earnest during the autumn of 1957 when Attorney General Robert Kennedy launched what would become the most sustained and comprehensive attack on organized crime in the nation's history. The young Kennedy's crusade against the criminal underworld was motivated by a combination of genuine moral conviction and astute political calculation, as he recognized that the fight against organized crime could serve both his personal ambitions and the broader goals of the Kennedy family's political dynasty. The Senate hearings that began in 1957 represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between organized crime and the federal government, as televised proceedings brought the faces and voices of America's most notorious criminals directly into the living rooms of ordinary citizens. The committee hearings, officially known as the Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, provided a platform for dramatic confrontations between federal prosecutors and criminal figures who had previously operated with relative anonymity. Sam's first appearance before the Senate committee in November 1957 marked the beginning of a period when his every public movement would be scrutinized by federal agents, newspaper reporters, and television cameras. The man who had spent decades perfecting the art of operating from the shadows suddenly found himself thrust into a spotlight that would follow him for the remainder of his life, transforming him from a successful criminal into a celebrity whose notoriety would eventually overshadow his actual accomplishments. The committee hearing room in the Russell Senate Office Building became a stage for a carefully orchestrated drama that pitted the forces of law and order against the representatives of organized crime in a confrontation that was designed as much for public consumption as for actual fact finding. The marble columns and mahogany paneling created an atmosphere of governmental dignity that contrasted sharply with the rough-hewn backgrounds and street-smart attitudes of the criminals who were called to testify. Sam's performance during his testimony revealed the complex mixture of defiance and calculation that characterized his approach to this new phase of his career. His decision to invoke the Fifth Amendment in response to virtually every question was legally sound but politically damaging, as it created the impression that he had something to hide while denying him the opportunity to present his own version of events or to challenge the assumptions and accusations that were being made against him. The media coverage that accompanied these hearings transformed Sam from a local criminal figure into a national symbol of organized crime's threat to American society. Newspaper headlines and television reports portrayed him as the embodiment of a criminal conspiracy that threatened the fundamental values and institutions of democratic government, creating a public image that bore little resemblance to the complex reality of his actual activities and motivations. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's response to the increased political pressure created by the Senate hearings was to dramatically expand its surveillance and investigation of Sam's activities, deploying resources and techniques that had previously been reserved for national security cases. The Top Hoodlum program, launched by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover in 1957, made Sam one of its primary targets, subjecting him to a level of scrutiny that made normal business operations increasingly difficult and dangerous. The surveillance techniques that the FBI employed during this period represented the most advanced investigative methods available to American law enforcement agencies at the time. Electronic listening devices were installed in Sam's home, his business offices, and even his automobile, creating a comprehensive monitoring system that captured not only his criminal activities, but also his most intimate personal conversations and private moments. The psychological impact of living under constant surveillance proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of this intensified law enforcement pressure. Sam's awareness that federal agents were probably listening to his telephone conversations, following his movements, and attempting to recruit informants from among his associates created a level of paranoia and tension that affected every aspect of his daily life and gradually eroded the trust and spontaneity that had previously characterized his relationships with family members and close associates. The legal strategy that Sam's attorneys developed in response to this escalating pressure involved a combination of constitutional challenges to federal investigative techniques and systematic efforts to delay and complicate the prosecution of any criminal charges that might be brought against him. The strategy was expensive and time consuming, requiring the services of some of the nation's most skilled criminal defense attorneys, but it provided Sam with the breathing room necessary to adapt his operations to the new reality of intensive federal scrutiny. The impact of increased law enforcement pressure extended beyond Sam's personal situation to affect the entire structure and operations of the Chicago outfit. Traditional methods of communication and coordination had to be abandoned in favor of more secure but less efficient alternatives, while many profitable activities were curtailed or suspended entirely to avoid creating additional evidence that federal prosecutors might use in criminal cases. The business disruptions caused by intensive federal investigation created financial pressures that tested the loyalty and patience of organization members who had grown accustomed to the steady revenues that Sam's leadership had previously provided. Some associates began to question whether the benefits of continued association with Sam outweighed the risks of being caught up in whatever legal difficulties might develop from the ongoing federal investigation. The congressional hearings that continued throughout 1958 and 1959 provided a forum for dramatic testimony from former organization members who had been convinced to cooperate with federal fined authorities in exchange for reduced sentences or other forms of legal consideration. These witnesses provided investigators with detailed information about the internal operations of the Chicago outfit, while also creating a public narrative that portrayed Sam as the ruthless leader of a criminal conspiracy that corrupted American society at every level. The testimony of Joseph Valachi, a former member of New York's Genovese crime family, who became the first high-ranking criminal to publicly discuss the internal structure and operations of organized crime, provided federal investigators with confirmation of many of their theories about how criminal organizations functioned, while also establishing a framework for understanding Sam's role within the national network of criminal profit enterprises. The media attention that accompanied these revelations transformed Sam into a figure of national fascination and the nexty self as Americans struggled to understand how someone who had grown up in their own communities could become involved in activities that seemed to threaten the very foundations of democratic society. Magazine articles and television documentaries explored his background and motivations, creating a public persona that combined elements of fear and admiration in ways that reflected the complex relationship between Americans and the criminal figures who violated society's rules while appearing to live lives of Omayas. Extraordinary luxury and excitement. The international attention that Sam's notoriety attracted created additional problems for his business operations as foreign governments began to scrutinize American criminal organizations and their possible connections to local criminal groups in other countries. The Swiss banking relationships and Caribbean business ventures that had been crucial components of the organization's money laundering operations came under investigation by foreign law enforcement agencies, forcing Sam to develop alternative methods for managing his international financial arrangements. The strain of living under constant public scrutiny began to manifest itself in Sam's personal behavior and decision making processes during this period. The calm, calculating approach that had characterized his earlier criminal career was increasingly replaced by impulsive reactions and dramatic gestures that seemed designed more to maintain his public image than to advance his actual business interests. The relationship between Sam and various federal law enforcement agencies became a kind of elaborate chess game, with each side attempting to anticipate and counter the other's moves while maintaining the appearance of operating within established legal and constitutional boundaries. The FBI's surveillance operations provided investigators with enormous amounts of information about Sam's activities, but much of this intelligence could not be used in criminal prosecutions because it had been gathered through techniques that might not withstand legal challenges. The political dimensions of the federal campaign against organized crime created additional complications for Sam's situation as his prosecution became intertwined with the broader ambitions and rivalries of various political figures who saw the fight against crime as a vehicle for advancing their own careers and agendas. The Kennedy administration's commitment to breaking the power of organized crime was genuine, but it was also influenced by political calculations about how this campaign might affect public perceptions of Democratic Party leadership and competence. The legal battles that consumed increasing amounts of Sam's time and resources during this period represented a fundamental shift in the nature of his criminal enterprise, as traditional revenue generating activities were gradually overshadowed by the demands of legal defense and the management of public relations challenges. The millions of dollars that had once been reinvested in expanding criminal operations were now being spent on attorneys, investigators, and public relations consultants who were attempting to minimize the damage caused by negative publicity and legal proceedings. As the 1950s drew to a close and the Kennedy administration prepared to intensify its campaign against organized crime, Sam found himself trapped in a situation that his earlier success had made inevitable. The wealth and power that he had accumulated through decades of careful planning and strategic thinking had made him a target too valuable and visible for federal authorities to ignore. While his public notoriety had eliminated the anonymity that had previously been his most valuable protection against law enforcement pressure, the foundation had been laid for even more intensive government scrutiny and legal challenges that would ultimately test not only Sam's ability to maintain his criminal enterprise, but also his capacity to preserve his freedom and done, perhaps even his life, in the face of enemies who possessed resources and determination that matched his own. The corrosive effects of sustained federal pressure on the bonds of loyalty and trust that held the Chicago outfit together became increasingly apparent during the early 1960s, as the relentless scrutiny from law enforcement agencies created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that poisoned relationships that had been built over decades of shared risks and mutual dependence. The code of silence that had once bound the organization's members together with bonds stronger than legal contracts began to fracture under the weight of lengthy prison sentences, intensive surveillance, and the constant fear that former friends and associates might be cooperating with federal investigators. Sam's daily routine during this period was dominated by the exhausting process of maintaining security while attempting to conduct the business that provided income for the organization and its members. The spontaneous meetings and casual conversations that had once characterized his leadership style were replaced by elaborate precautions that included counter surveillance measures, coded communications, and the use of multiple intermediaries for even routine business discussions. The natural flow of information and decision making that had made the organization so effective was gradually being strangled by the security requirements that survival in the new environment demanded. The first significant crack in the organization's solidarity appeared in the spring of 1962 when Charles Nicoletti, a longtime member who had been arrested on federal racketeering charges, began showing signs of wavering in his commitment to the traditional code of silence. Nicoletti had been facing a potential sentence of 20 years in federal prison, a prospect that seemed to weigh more heavily on him as he contemplated the impact such a lengthy incarceration would have on his wife and teenage children. The subtle changes in Nicoletti's behavior were noticed first by other organization members who had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect signs of potential betrayal among their associates. The slightly longer pauses before he responded to certain questions, the tendency to avoid eye contact during discussions of sensitive matters, and the increased interest he showed in the personal problems and family situations of other members all created a pattern that experienced criminals recognized as potentially dangerous. Sam's response to these early warning signs revealed both his continued strategic thinking and the gradual erosion of the paternal leadership style that had once characterized his management of the organization. Rather than attempting to address Nicoletti's concerns through the kind of personal conversation and reassurance that might have resolved the problem in earlier years, Sam chose to isolate him from sensitive information while initiating discreet inquiries into his recent activities and associations. The investigation into Nicoletti's loyalty was conducted with the same methodical thoroughness that Sam had always brought to important organizational decisions, but the process itself reflected how fundamentally the organization had changed under the pressure of federal scrutiny. The natural trust and communication that had once allowed Sam to understand and respond to his associates' concerns had been replaced by a system of surveillance and suspicion that turned organization members into potential threats rather than valued colleagues. The evidence that gradually accumulated suggested that Nicoletti had indeed been approached by federal agents and was at least considering the possibility of cooperation in exchange for reduced charges and protection for his family. The approach had been made through his attorney, who had suggested that cooperation might be the only realistic option for avoiding a lengthy prison sentence that would effectively end his ability to provide for his wife and children. The decision about how to respond to Nicoletti's potential betrayal created a dilemma that exemplified the impossible choices that Sam faced during this period of organizational decline. Traditional criminal justice would have demanded Nicoletti's immediate elimination, both as punishment for his disloyalty and as a warning to other organization members who might be considering similar betrayals. However, such action would have confirmed federal investigators' suspicions about the organization's willingness to use violence against potential witnesses, while also eliminating any possibility of determining exactly what information Nicoletti might have already provided to authorities. The solution that Sam ultimately chose reflected both his continued sophistication and his recognition that the old rules no longer applied in the new environment that federal pressure had created. Rather than ordering Nicoletti's death, he arranged for him to be transferred to a position within the organization where he would have access only to information that was already known to federal investigators, while also ensuring that he received enough financial support to make cooperation with authorities less attractive. This approach required Sam to essentially write off a longtime associate while also accepting the reality that the organization could no longer guarantee the absolute loyalty that had once been its greatest strength. The psychological impact of this compromise extended throughout the organization as other members recognized that even longtime associates could become potential threats who had to be managed rather than trusted. The paranoia that gradually consumed the organization during this period was fed by a series of incidents that suggested federal investigators were indeed receiving information from sources within the group, raids that seemed to anticipate the organization's activities, arrests that occurred at precisely the moments when they would cause maximum disruption, and investigations that focused on details that should have been known only to organization members all contributed to a growing conviction that the group had been penetrated by informants. The process of identifying these suspected informants created additional divisions within the organization as members began to scrutinize each other's behavior and question the loyalty of associates who had previously been beyond suspicion. Long-standing friendships were poisoned by doubt, while the natural cooperation and mutual support that had made the organization effective were replaced by a climate of suspicion that made normal business operations increasingly difficult. Anthony Spilotro, who had emerged as one of Sam's most trusted lieutenants during the late 1950s, found himself caught between his continued loyalty to the organization and his growing recognition that its traditional methods were no longer adequate for survival in the hostile environment that federal pressure had created. Spilotro's reputation for both intelligence and ruthlessness had made him a valuable asset during the organization's period of expansion, but the same qualities now made him a target for federal investigators who hoped to use him as a source of information about Sam's activities. The relationship between Sam and Spilotro during this period revealed the complex dynamics that governed interactions within an organization that was slowly being torn apart by external pressure and internal suspicion. Their conversations, which had once been characterized by the easy familiarity of men who shared common goals and mutual respect, became careful exercises in communication that avoided sensitive topics while attempting to maintain some semblance of the personal connection that had once bound the organization together. The financial pressures that accompanied this period of organizational decline created additional stresses that tested the loyalty of members who had joined the group primarily for economic rather than personal reasons. The revenues that had once flowed steadily from gambling, labor racketeering, and other traditional criminal activities were being disrupted by law enforcement pressure, while the costs of legal defense and security measures continued to escalate. The reduction in available income forced Sam to make difficult decisions about which activities to maintain and which members to support during their legal difficulties. These choices inevitably created resentment among those who felt they were not receiving adequate assistance, while also reinforcing the impression that the organization was in decline and might no longer be able to protect its members from the consequences of their criminal activities. The psychological transformation that Sam underwent during this period was perhaps most evident in his relationships with newer organization members who had not shared the experiences and hardships that had bound the older generation. Together, these younger associates had been attracted to the organization by its reputation for success and its apparent immunity from law enforcement interference, but they had not developed the personal loyalty and commitment that might have sustained them through the current period of adversity. The generational divide that emerged within the organization during the early 1960s reflected broader changes in American society that were making traditional forms of criminal organization less effective and sustainable. The younger members who had grown up in the prosperity of the post war period were less willing to accept the personal sacrifices and long term risks that membership in a criminal organization required, while also being more susceptible to the appeals that federal investigators made regarding the benefits of cooperation. The impact of intensive federal surveillance on the organization's ability to maintain discipline and cohesion was perhaps most evident in the gradual breakdown of the social rituals and informal gatherings that had once served to reinforce group solidarity and shared identity. The restaurants, social clubs, and private homes where organization members had traditionally met to discuss business and maintain personal relationships were now known to be under surveillance, making casual interaction dangerous and forcing important conversations into increasingly awkward and unsatisfactory formats. The isolation that this surveillance created gradually eroded the sense of brotherhood and mutual obligation that had been the organization's greatest source of strength during its period of growth and success. Members who had once thought of themselves as part of an extended family, bound together by shared values and common interests, began to see each other as potential threats whose actions might compromise their own safety and freedom. The cultural changes that were transforming American society during the 1960s also contributed to the organization's difficulties, as traditional concepts of loyalty, honor, and masculine solidarity were being challenged by new social movements and changing generational attitudes. The code of silence that had once been reinforced by cultural values and community pressure was weakening as younger Americans became more individualistic and less willing to accept the personal costs that loyalty to criminal organizations required. As the organization that Sam had spent decades building began to fracture under the combined pressures of federal investigation, internal suspicion, and changing social conditions, the man who had once commanded absolute loyalty from hundreds of associates found himself increasingly isolated and surrounded by individuals whose commitment was conditional and whose trustworthiness was constantly in question. The foundation had been laid for the final phase of his criminal career, when these accumulated pressures would ultimately lead to consequences that even his strategic intelligence and vast experience could not prevent or control. The final chapter of Sam Giancana's extraordinary criminal career began to unfold during the oppressive heat of summer 1975 when his return to Chicago from 8 years of self imposed exile in Mexico marked the beginning of a chain of events that would bring his remarkable life to its violent conclusion. The man who had once commanded one of America's most powerful criminal organizations now found himself in the precarious position of being both too dangerous to ignore and too knowledgeable to be allowed to live freely in a world oblast ein and the Marning Five, where his former associates had grown comfortable with his absence. The decision to return to Chicago had been motivated by a complex mixture of nostalgia, practical considerations, and perhaps an underlying recognition that the exile which had protected him from federal prosecution had also cut him off from the sources of power and influence that had defined his identity for more than 4 decades. The modest house in Cuernavaca, where he had spent his Mexican years, had provided safety and relative comfort, but it had also imposed a kind of living death on a man whose sense of self had always been intimately connected to his ability to influence events and command respect. The Chicago that Sam encountered upon his return in 1974 bore little resemblance to the city where he had built his criminal empire during the prosperous decades following World War II. The political machine that had once provided reliable protection for organized crime activities had been weakened by reform movements and federal investigations, while the ethnic neighborhoods that had served as recruiting grounds and safe havens for criminal organizations had been transformed by urban renewal projects and demographic changes that altered their fundamental character. More significantly, the Chicago outfit itself had undergone profound changes during Sam's absence, as new leadership had emerged to fill the vacuum created by his departure and the imprisonment or death of many of his longtime associates. The organization that had once operated according to principles and traditions that Sam had helped establish had adapted to new realities and new opportunities in ways that sometimes conflicted with his expectations and preferences. The relationship between Sam and the current leadership of the Chicago outfit was complicated by questions about his intentions and the extent to which his return might disrupt arrangements that had been functioning effectively during his SBEC absence. Tony Accardo, who had assumed greater authority within the organization during the 1960s and 70s, found himself in the delicate position of respecting Sam's historical contributions while protecting the interests of an organization that had learned to operate without his direct involvement. The conversations that took place during the months following Sam's return were characterized by the kind of elaborate courtesy and indirect communication that had always characterized high-level discussions within organized crime, but they also revealed underlying tensions that reflected the fundamental changes that had occurred during his years of exile. The younger generation of criminals, who now occupied positions of authority within the organization, had different perspectives on business practices, territorial arrangements, and relationships with law enforcement agencies. Sam's financial situation during this period was more precarious than most observers realized, as the costs of maintaining his Mexican exile and the legal expenses associated with his ongoing federal problems had substantially reduced the enormous wealth he had accumulated during his years of power. The business interests and investment portfolios that had once provided him with financial security had been managed by others during his absence, and the returns from these holdings had been affected by both market conditions and management decisions that had not always served his interests. The isolation that Sam experienced during his final months in Chicago was perhaps the most psychologically difficult aspect of his situation, as he discovered that many of the relationships and associations that had once defined his social world were no longer available to him. Former associates who had once competed for his attention now seemed reluctant to be seen in his company, while legitimate businessmen and social contacts who had once courted his friendship were careful to maintain their distance from someone whose notoriety might compromise their own reputations. The surveillance that federal agencies maintained on Sam's activities during this period was less intensive than it had been during the peak years of his criminal career, but it was still sufficient to complicate his daily routine and remind him that his movements were being monitored by agencies that retained their interest in his activities. The knowledge that his telephone conversations were probably being recorded and his meetings were likely being observed added another layer of stress to a situation that was already fraught with personal and professional difficulties. The health problems that began to manifest themselves during this period were likely related to the accumulated stress of decades spent in criminal enterprises, combined with the specific pressures of his current situation and his advancing age. The heart condition that required regular medical attention served as a constant reminder of his mortality and vulnerability, while also creating practical complications for someone whose lifestyle had always required considerable physical energy and psychological resilience. The family relationships that might have provided Sam with emotional support during this difficult period were strained by the years of separation and the ongoing concerns about safety and public exposure that continued to govern all aspects of his personal life. His daughters had established their own lives and families during his absence, and their relationships with him were complicated by their desire to maintain some connection with their father while protecting themselves and their children from the potential consequences of association with his reputation and activities. The legitimate business interests that Sam attempted to develop during his final months represented perhaps his most genuine effort to establish a life that was independent of criminal activities and the complex web of obligations and dangers that had defined his adult existence. The restaurant investments and real estate ventures that occupied some of his attention during this period suggested that he was attempting to create sources of income and personal satisfaction that would not depend on the criminal, relationships that had become increasingly unreliable and dangerous. The social gatherings that Sam occasionally hosted at his Oak Park home during this period revealed both his continued need for human companionship and his awareness that the circle of people who were willing to associate with him had shrunk dramatically from the days when politicians, entertainers, and businessmen had competed for invitations to his dinner parties. The conversations at these smaller, more intimate gatherings often took on a nostalgic quality as participants reminisced about earlier times when the risks had seemed smaller and the opportunities had appeared limitless. The federal investigations that continued to focus on Sam's historical activities created an additional source of stress during this period, as prosecutors and investigators attempted to build cases based on evidence that had been gathered over decades of surveillance and testimony from former associates who had chosen to cooperate with authorities. The possibility that he might still face criminal charges for activities that had occurred years or even decades earlier served as a constant reminder that his legal problems were far from resolved. The changing nature of organized crime in America during the 1970s also contributed to Sam's sense of displacement and irrelevance, as new criminal opportunities and new organizational methods had emerged that did not depend on the kind of territorial control and political influence that had been central to his earlier success. The drug trafficking that was becoming increasingly important to criminal enterprises required different skills and different relationships from those that had characterized his generation's approach to organized crime. The morning of June 19th, 1975, began like many others during Sam's final months, with a routine that reflected both his advancing age and his reduced circumstances. The breakfast that he prepared in the kitchen of his modest Oak Park home was a simple affair, quite different from the elaborate meals that had once been served by household staff in the grander residences he had occupied during his years of power and wealth. The telephone call that interrupted his morning routine came from someone whose identity would never be definitively established, but whose message was apparently sufficient to convince Sam to remain at home rather than following through with plans he had made for the afternoon. The decision to alter his schedule on such short notice suggested either a level of trust in the caller or a recognition that he had little choice but to comply with whatever request or demand had been made. The events that followed that telephone call unfolded with the kind of swift efficiency that suggested careful planning and professional execution, characteristics that had always marked the most serious actions undertaken by organized crime figures. The individuals who gained access to Sam's home were apparently known to him, as there were no signs of forced entry or struggle that might have indicated resistance or surprise on his part. The method of execution that was employed suggested both personal animosity and a desire to send a specific message to others who might be observing the situation. The multiple gunshot wounds and the symbolic placement of the body indicated that this was not simply a business decision, but rather a settling of accounts that involved personal grievances and organizational considerations that extended beyond immediate practical concerns. The discovery of Sam's body by his housekeeper the following morning marked the end of one of the most remarkable criminal careers in American history, bringing to a close the life of a man who had risen from immigrant poverty to command extraordinary power and influence before ultimately falling victim to the same forces of violence and betrayal that he had used to build and maintain his criminal empire. The investigation that followed his death would never produce definitive answers about the identity of his killers or the specific motivations that had led to his elimination, but the broader context suggested that Sam Giancana had finally succumbed to the inevitable reckoning that awaits those who choose to live by the harsh rules of organized crime. The empire he had built with such intelligence and determination had ultimately turned against its creator, providing the final lesson in the dangerous mathematics of power and loyalty that had governed his extraordinary life. The death of Sam Giancana in the summer of 1975 marked not merely the end of an individual criminal career, but the conclusion of an entire era in the history of American organized crime. The man who had risen from the poverty of Chicago's Little Italy to command one of the nation's most powerful criminal enterprises had lived through and helped shape a period of unprecedented expansion and sophistication in Minas Day. Organized criminal activity, leaving behind a legacy that would influence both law enforcement strategies and criminal methodologies for generations to come. The immediate impact of Sam's assassination was felt most acutely within the Chicago outfit itself, where his death created both opportunities and uncertainties that would reshape the organization's structure and operations for decades. The vacuum left by his elimination was not simply a matter of replacing one leader with another, but rather involved the complex redistribution of territorial control, business relationships, and political connections that had been accumulated and maintained through his personal efforts over more than 4 decades of criminal activity. Tony Accardo, who had served as Sam's lieutenant and occasional rival, found himself in the position of having to manage an organization that had been profoundly shaped by his predecessor's personality and methods while adapting to new challenges and opportunities that required different approaches and consider to different skills. The consolidation of power that followed Sam's death was accomplished with relatively little violence, suggesting that the organization had learned from the destabilizing effects of internal conflict and was committed to preserving the institutional knowledge and relationships that constituted its most valuable assets. The law enforcement response to Sam's death revealed the complex relationship that had developed between organized crime figures and the federal agencies that were officially committed to their destruction. While public statements from FBI and Justice Department officials expressed satisfaction that one of America's most notorious criminals had been eliminated, private communications among law enforcement personnel suggested that Sam's death had also eliminated a valuable source of intelligence about the structure and operations of organized crime families throughout the United States. The congressional investigations that had made Sam a household name during the late 1950s and early 1960s had established him as the archetypal American crime boss, and his death provided an opportunity for politicians and law enforcement officials to claim victory in the ongoing war against organized crime, while also acknowledging the persistent challenges that remained in combating sophisticated criminal enterprises. The symbolic value of his elimination was perhaps more significant than its practical impact on actual criminal activity. The media coverage that surrounded Sam's death and its aftermath reflected the complex mixture of fascination and revulsion that had characterized public attitudes toward organized crime figures throughout the 20th century. Newspaper articles and television reports portrayed him as both a dangerous criminal whose elimination made America safer and a larger than life figure whose death marked the end of a colorful and dramatic chapter in the nation's criminal history. The books and movies that would eventually be produced about Sam's life and career contributed to the creation of a popular mythology that often bore little resemblance to the actual circumstances of his criminal activities, but served important cultural functions in helping Americans understand and process their ambivalent feelings about success, violence, and the pursuit of the American dream through illegitimate means. These fictional portrayals would ultimately prove more influential in shaping public perceptions than the actual facts of his biography. The academic studies that began to appear in the years following Sam's death provided more systematic analysis of his role in the development of modern organized crime, examining both his innovations in criminal methodology and his contributions to the evolution of relationships between criminal organizations and legitimate institutions. Criminologists and sociologists found in his career a valuable case study for understanding how intelligence, strategic thinking, and organizational skills could be applied to illegal enterprises with results that rivaled those achieved by legitimate businesses and political organizations. The influence that Sam's methods had on subsequent generations of criminals extended far beyond the boundaries of traditional organized crime, as his systematic approach to corruption, violence, and business development provided templates that would be adapted and modified by drug trafficking organizations, white collar criminals, and various forms of international criminal enterprises. The principles of organization and strategy that he had developed during his rise to power proved to be applicable to a wide range of illegal activities and criminal environments. The transformation of the Chicago outfit that occurred in the decades following Sam's death reflected both the continuing relevance of his organizational innovations and the changing nature of criminal opportunities in late 20th century America. While the specific activities that had generated his wealth and power were affected by legal changes, technological developments, and shifts in law enforcement priorities, the fundamental approaches to criminal enterprise that he had pioneered remained valuable for organizations that could adapt them to new circumstances. The impact of Sam's career on law enforcement methods and strategies was perhaps most evident in the development of sophisticated surveillance techniques, financial investigation procedures, and interagency cooperation protocols that were designed to combat the kind of complex, multi jurisdictional criminal enterprises that he had created. The federal law enforcement apparatus that had been mobilized against him during the 1950s and 60s became the foundation for more comprehensive approaches to organized crime investigation that would be applied to subsequent challenges. The corruption networks that Sam had established and maintained throughout his career provided law enforcement agencies with valuable intelligence about the vulnerabilities of political and judicial systems, leading to reforms in government procedures and oversight mechanisms that were designed to make such systematic corruption more difficult to achieve and maintain. The relationships he had developed with police, prosecutors, judges, and politicians served as case studies for understanding how criminal organizations could penetrate and influence legitimate institutions. The international connections that Sam had cultivated during his years of power contributed to the recognition that organized crime was increasingly becoming a global phenomenon that required international cooperation and coordination among law enforcement agencies. His relationships with criminal organizations in other countries helped to establish the foundation for understanding how modern criminal enterprises could operate across national boundaries while exploiting differences in legal systems and law enforcement capabilities. The financial innovations that Sam had pioneered in money laundering and the integration of criminal proceeds into legitimate business enterprises became subjects of intensive study by both law enforcement agencies and academic researchers, who sought to understand and combat the economic dimensions of organized crime. The techniques he had developed for disguising the sources of illegal income and investing criminal profits in legal ventures provided templates that would be used by subsequent generations of sophisticated criminals. The family legacy that Sam left behind reflected the complex personal costs of a life spent in organized crime, as his descendants struggled to establish identities and careers that were independent of his notorious reputation, while also dealing with the ongoing consequences of their association with his name and history. The Giancana family's efforts to create normal lives while managing the burden of their patriarch's criminal legacy illustrated the intergenerational effects of involvement in organized crime. The neighborhoods and communities where Sam had grown up and established his criminal operations were permanently changed by his activities and their consequences as the cycles of violence, corruption, and economic distortion that accompanied organized crime left lasting impacts on the social fabric and economic development of Chicago's Italian American communities. The positive contributions that Italian immigrants had made to American society were often overshadowed by the notoriety of criminals like Sam, who had emerged from those same communities. The cultural impact of Sam's life and career extended beyond its immediate effects on crime and law enforcement to influence broader American attitudes toward authority, success, and the relationship between individual ambition and social responsibility. His story became part of a larger narrative about the dark side of the American dream, illustrating how the same entrepreneurial energy and strategic thinking that could lead to legitimate success could also be channeled into criminal enterprises with devastating consequences for both perpetrators and society. The lessons that emerged from Sam's extraordinary career were complex and often contradictory, reflecting the fundamental tensions between individual achievement and social order that have always characterized American society. His intelligence, determination, and organizational skills were qualities that might have led to remarkable success in legitimate enterprises, but his choice to apply those talents to criminal activities ultimately led to consequences that destroyed not only his own life, but also the lives of many others who became caught up in the violence and corruption that surrounded his activities. As the decades passed following his death, Sam Giancana's legacy continued to evolve and develop new meanings for successive generations of Americans who sought to understand the complex relationships between crime, power, and society in the modern world. His life story remained a compelling illustration of both the possibilities and the dangers inherent in a society that celebrated individual achievement while struggling to maintain the social bonds and moral constraints that made such achievement meaningful and sustainable. The final assessment of Sam Giancana's impact on American society must acknowledge both the remarkable scope of his criminal achievements and the enormous costs that those achievements imposed on his family, his community, and the broader society that was affected by his activities. His story serves as both a cautionary tale about the consequences of choosing criminal paths to success and a complex illustration of the intelligence, determination, and organizational capabilities that human beings can apply to any enterprise they choose to pursue, whether legitimate or criminal.